Chapter 52. Little bastard. You are going too far. After a while, Zhu Yin squeezed a sentence from her teeth. How much more do you want? Not much, just 3,000 taels. I will do what you ask me to do neatly. Chu Qingning bent over and rubbed his hands. His eyes were shining, which reminded Zhu Yin of a hungry wolf with green eyes. 3,000 taels. Plus the 1,000 taels I gave you before, it is 4,000 taels. Zhu Yan's eyes were red, and her face was so ugly that she almost wanted to eat someone. She said, Little bastard, do you really think that I dare not to fight with you? If this matter is exposed, you can hardly escape from prison. Madam, I have long been tired of this low-level threat. Chu Qingning picked his ears and looked like a dead pig, not afraid of boiling water. He said, I am barefoot and can't run away. But Madame Zhu is different. Your foundation is in the Desu town. 3,000 taels is cheap enough. What do you think? Zhu Yin was angry. This little bastard had obviously planned for a long time and investigated her details clearly. No wonder he was so confident. Good boy. Zhu Yin gritted her teeth and took out 3 banknotes from her arms. She said, You are so bold. I want to see how you spin the 3,000 taels. Su Huanli, who was behind the Buddha statue, watched Zhu Yin hand over 3,000 taels to Chu Qingning. He was so angry that his eyes almost popped out. It was all the money of the Su family. Zhu Yin, the bitch, was greedy for so much money of the Su family. He struggled desperately and wanted to rush out. Suddenly, a stone came from behind and broke the rope. Su Huanli felt that he could move. He was overjoyed at once. He shook off the rope and rushed out with a roar. Zhu Yin, how dare you lie to me? Zhu Yin was stunned. Looking at Su Huanli, who suddenly appeared, she even thought that she was in a nightmare. How could the master be here? Old woman, you even set me up. Chu Qingning was shocked and angry when he was suddenly exposed. He let out an extremely panicked roar and immediately fled in a hurry. However, he did not leave the 3,000 taels in his hand. Zhu Yin saw that Chu Qingning disappeared in a twinkling of an eye. She was left alone to face the furious Su Huanli. She was immediately stunned. Why did things become like this? How did the master chase her here? Did he not trust her and follow her all the way? Pa. Before Zhu Yin could think more, she saw a slap in front of her. The next moment, she felt a sharp pain on her left cheek. Zhu Yin screamed in pain and was slapped to the ground. Her left cheek swelled up at a speed visible to the naked eye. Su Huanli didn't show any mercy in this slap. Su Huanli had been married to Zhu Yin for many years, but he had never been so angry. Even though he knew that Zhu Yin seemed to be in harmony with him, he did not expect that his nominal wife had done all the bad things secretly. Now, he even wanted to harm his own daughter. Bitch, even a vicious tiger will not eat its cubs. You even want to marry Su Li to a beggar. What is your intention? Pulling Zhu Yan's hair, Su Huanli beat her violently. Zhu Yin had a bloody nose and a swollen face. She screamed and begged for mercy. Master, stop beating me. I know I'm wrong. It hurts. Stop hitting me. Su Huanli was dominated by anger and turned a deaf ear to Zhu Yan's screams. It seemed that he was still angry and looked around. When he saw a broken table, he immediately walked over and broke off a table leg. When Zhu Yin saw this scene, she was so scared that her face turned pale. She struggled to climb out. Su Huanli sneered and directly waved a stick on Zhu Yan's back. You hurt people and steal money. I will beat you to death. Chu Qingning ran very fast and didn't know what happened behind. At this moment, he returned to the valley with 3,000 taels of silver. He solved a problem and got 3,000 taels of silver. It was really cool. Boss, you are back. Seeing Chu Qingning, Haydn ran over and wiped his sweat. Boss, look at the house we built. Okay. Chu Qingning touched Haydn's head, which was lower than him, and walked to the open space not far from Su Li's bamboo building. What he saw made him frown slightly. Haydn also knew what Chu Qingning was thinking and couldn't help but smile bitterly. Boss, although the valley is hidden, the space is too small. I discussed with Goshing for a long time and could only make such a large foundation. Otherwise, the bamboo house can't be built high because of the mountain rocks. That's right. Chu Qingning rubbed his chin and seemed to be thinking about something. After a long time, he turned his head and told Haydn to call Feng Yuan. Before long, Feng Yuan appeared in front of Chu Qingning. With his cultivation and body movements, it only took him a few minutes to come to the valley, which was faster than taking a carriage. Why do you call me here? Feng Yuan came over and asked. Then he saw the small foundation on the ground and immediately understood. He hesitated and said, What do you want to do? Chu Qingning smiled and whispered, The poisonous insect Zhan of the Chu family is with me. What do you think I want to do? Feng Yuan's expression changed slightly and he was shocked. He couldn't believe it and said, How could it be with you? Have you succeeded as the head of the family before? The big families with a long history in Nanjiang all had their own unique inheritance of the poisonous insect. The Feng family and the Chu family were no exception. However, the poisonous insect, which was related to the inheritance, was passed down from generation to generation. Only the head of the family was qualified to inherit it. Feng Yuan was the young head of the family. In the future, he would inherit the poisonous insect of the Feng family. Unfortunately, the family was destroyed and the poisonous insect was missing. Chu Qingning touched his heart and looked lonely. I met my father on the way to escape. He protected me for a while and was... Feng Yuan pursed his lips. The two teenagers were silent for a long time. After a long time, Chu Qingning suddenly woke up from the memory. He smiled and said, Let's not talk about this. In this situation, it is the time for the poisonous heart-biting insect of the Chu family to show off. Feng Yuan's eyes twitched and he sneered expressionlessly. If he knows that you let the poisonous heart-biting insect eat soil, I am afraid that your father will climb out of the coffin and kill you. Chu Qingning smiled and said, My father won't blame me because of the situation. I have to discuss with Su Li. If I build the valley with the poisonous heart-biting insect, it will be a wonderful hiding place that is easy to defend and difficult to attack. Then Chu Qingning left the valley happily. He disguised himself and found Su Li in the byway building. The poisonous heart-biting insect? Su Li raised her eyebrows. Chu Qingning was about to explain the use of the poisonous heart-biting insect, but he was stopped by Su Li, the poisonous heart-biting insect. I didn't expect that you are the direct descendant of Nanjiang. Su Li looked Chu Qingning up and down and said, I happen to think that the valley is small. Although it is a little strange to dig stones with the poisonous heart-biting insect, since you are willing to do it, then do it. At least widen the valley by 3 times, and it will be better if it can accommodate a large yard. Chu Qingning was speechless. He came here to show off and expected to see some surprise on the face of the girl who had always been calm. Unexpectedly, Su Li knew the poisonous heart-biting insect so well. Was there anything else she didn't know? When he heard that Su Li widened the valley by 3 times, he was even more shocked and felt a dull pain all over his body. It was extremely laborious for him to drive the poisonous heart-biting insect with his cultivation. If it was widened by 3 times, wouldn't it cost him half of his life? Su Li smiled and said, I don't ask you to dig it immediately. While digging, Haydn and others build a yard. You can also relax. Chu Qingning wanted to cry but had no tears. He could only accept Su Li's proposal. After all, they built the place where they lived. It was okay if it was a little hard. If it was before, they didn't even have the conditions to build a house. The money was all paid by Su Li, by the way. I saw that you bought a lot of polished glutinous rice and asked Haydn and others to pick osmanthus. What are you going to do? Chu Qingning knew that Su Li was very good at cooking, but the polished glutinous rice, what could she do? Was she going to cook? When you build a yard, you will know. The things are all bought from the black market. You should know my intention. Su Li warned him. Chu Qingning was a little less calm than Feng Yuan, so she couldn't help but remind him. I know. Chu Qingning pointed to himself and said, I am in disguise, and my identity is sensitive now. I won't come to you if I can. After saying this, Chu Qingning rushed into the dark alley and disappeared. Su Li looked at the dark alley, which almost devoured people. Her eyes were as deep as the sea. Now, she finally had 2 partners, but her actions in the future would inevitably arouse their suspicions and disgust. No one knew how long this good relationship could last. Su sighed softly and put on the cloak. Then she immediately turned into another person and walked to the Baichaotang. The weather was getting colder and colder. The cold wind blew into the heavy armor. The young man stood on the high wall of the fortress, and his straight body did not tremble at all. A long spear was carried on his back, like a dragon rushing straight to the sky. His eyes were like lightning, looking at the wilderness far away. His iron-blooded face was like ice and snow that couldn't be melted. A chill lingered around, so that even the closest adjutant of the young man didn't dare to get too close. After a short while, a middle-aged man dressed as an adjutant came to the young man and whispered, "General, the scouts in the wilderness reported that they did not see any army of the Nanjiang country. The Nanjiang country has been in chaos for half a year. The 7 poisonous insect clans resisted fiercely. They are busy with their own affairs. I don't think they will attack here." "General." The young man seemed to be in his 20s, but he was the young general of the Dahan country. Such an identity was absolutely superior to any young talent in the Dahan country. In the era of frequent wars, the status of a general was destined to be much higher than that of a civil official. "Your idea is exactly what the Nanjiang country wants," the young man finally said in a cold voice. "I received the news that a lot of unidentified people came to the Desu town, which is the nearest to the fortress. Besides, there are many people in the martial arts circle. I heard that there is a hierarch of the Enma cult. Even I have to avoid such a person. Now do you dare to say that the fortress will be safe and sound?" The middle-aged adjutant's face finally changed. The Enma cult was an evil cult with hundreds of years of inheritance. What kind of person was the hierarch of the Enma cult? Maybe he had already reached the inborn realm. If he wanted to destroy them, it was a piece of cake. "Master, it is too dangerous here. You'd better go back to Yunjing." The middle-aged adjutant no longer called the young general and looked worried. "Bastard!" The young man scolded with a cold face. "All the members of the Ling family are loyal and brave. My father and my eldest brother all died on the battlefield. How can I run away?" He also heard that the death of his father and eldest brother had something to do with the Enma cult. How could he run away with the new and old hatred? The middle-aged adjutant sighed deeply and said, "Second master, even if you don't think for yourself, you should think for the third master." The second master was the only pillar of the Ling family now. Since the third master was secretly injured and disabled, he had already been degenerated and indulged in debauchery all day long. "Second young master, nothing must happen to you." But he was no match for the second master in terms of official position and strength. At most, he could only protect the second master with his life when he was in danger. Chapter 53. It was quite cold at night. Suli returned to the Su house in the cold dew. Before she took off her cloak, she saw Mammy Lee hurriedly came over and said, "Miss, something terrible happened. The first madam was beaten black and blue by the old master. I don't know why." Suli couldn't help but feel shocked. Su Huanli would beat people? What did Chu Qingning do to make Su Huanli so angry? Although she proposed this plan, she didn't expect the effect would be so good. After cleaning up, Suli left the courtyard without eating dinner. The Jinyuan court was not far from the wing where Zhu Yan lived. Suli just passed through 2 small courtyards and set foot on Zhu Yan's territory. This was the first time that she stepped into the West Wing since her rebirth. If her mother was injured, it would be unreasonable if she didn't come to see her. In the room, except for Zhu Yan who was lying on the bed, there were only the doctor and Su Zipei who sat by the bed and kept wiping tears. Su Zipei noticed that Suli came in. She looked back and saw Suli. Her face immediately became gloomy. "What are you doing here? Are you here to laugh at us?" Suli couldn't help but show a sad expression and stammered, "What are you talking about, third sister?" I just want to see my mother." Su Zipei looked at Suli and immediately got angry. She stood up and scolded, "What are you looking at? You can't see my mother. Get out of here as far as you can. We can't be friends with the shopkeeper of the Baiwei building." The doctor who was diagnosing shook his head when he saw this scene. The third miss of the Su family was still as bad as the rumor. Miss Suli was really unlucky. Suddenly, he put his hand on Zhu Yan's pulse and was shocked. He couldn't help but exclaim, "It's the pulse of pregnancy." "What? The first madam is pregnant. When Su Huanli heard the news, he was so shocked that the teacup in his hand fell to the ground and broke into several pieces. He immediately looked gloomy. He hadn't slept with Zhu Yin for a long time. How could Zhu Yin be pregnant? Su Huanli instantly felt that his head became green like Yang Li's. With a pale face, Su Huanli came to the west wing. He saw Su Li standing in front of the door and didn't dare to go in. He was soft-hearted and comforted her. Then he snorted and stepped into the room. Father. Su Zipei hadn't seen her father for a long time. She jumped up at once and said happily, "My mother must be pregnant with a little brother." Sure enough, as soon as he heard that they were pregnant, their father immediately came to see them. Su Huanli's expression was still ugly. He sat by the bed and looked at Zhu Yin, who was beaten into a pig's head. He said coldly, "Who's?" Zhu Yin had already woken up at the moment. After waking up, she heard the doctor's diagnosis and immediately became energetic. Unexpectedly, the first sentence that Su Huanli said when he came over was doubt. I'm not Su Yuezhu." Zhu Yin felt wronged and wanted to die. She said with difficulty, "Master, do you remember? The birthday party of the Yang family, that night you." Su Huanli's expression changed slightly. He drank too much that night, and his memory was not clear. It seemed that he came back with Zhu Yin, and then, counting the days, it was about time. Su Huanli's expression immediately softened a lot. He turned to the doctor and asked, "Doctor, what about the fetus in my wife's belly?" The doctor nodded and said, "Madam fell down, but it's only affected the fetus. I'll write a prescription for her to recuperate." "That's good." Su Huanli breathed a sigh of relief. If his mother knew that he beat Zhu Yin and the fetus was gone, his mother would definitely peel off his skin. "In this case, madam, take care of the fetus and don't be tired. Doctor, the tonic for madam's fetus will be in trouble." After Su Huanli finished, he asked Li Yin to send a message to his mother, "Ma'am." Su Chui, who was worshipping Buddha in the temple. Since the death of the head of the family, Ma'am. Su Chui had been living in the temple and praying for the safety of the Su family. Before she left, she told Su Huanli that if a new son was born in the Su family, he must inform her. Su Li saw this scene, and a smile flashed across the corner of her mouth. Would Ma'am Su Chui come back? In the previous life, most of her miserable ending was almost instigated by this old woman and Zhu Yin in collusion. She was worried that she was a little bored recently. The fifth son of the Su family was indeed a baby boy. Unfortunately, Zhu Yin gave birth to a dead baby, which directly made Ma'am Su Chui die of anger. On the third day after Li Yin sent the news, a carriage stopped in front of the Su house. Su Huanli immediately went out to greet them and opened the curtain personally. An old woman in plain clothes, who smelled of sandalwood, came down and grabbed Su Huanli and asked repeatedly, "Son, take me to see my future grandson." Su Huanli coughed twice. He wanted to say something but stopped on second thought. Finally, he didn't dare to say anything and helped his mother to the west wing. When Ma'am Su Chui saw Zhu Yan's swollen face, she suddenly turned pale with fright. "Yan, how did you get hurt like this? Who did it?" "Ma'am Su Chui favored Zhu Yin very much. Later, because Li Yuelian gave birth to two sons, she changed her view on Li Yuelian. But even if Zhu Yin gave birth to two daughters, she still spoiled Zhu Yin more than her own son. When Zhu Yin saw Ma'am Su Chui, her eyes were full of tears. She said aggrievedly, "Mother, it doesn't matter. I just fell down." "Io, my little Yin'er, what's going on?" "Ma'am." Su Chui was distressed and burst into tears. Su Huanli was relieved when Zhu Yin helped him to hide the truth. When he thought of his 5 sons who were about to be born, his resentment against Zhu Yin was much less. "Ma'am." Su Chui left to have a rest after chatting with Zhu Yin until the evening. As soon as Ma'am Su Chui came back, Su Li obviously felt that the atmosphere in the west courtyard of the Su house was different. The west courtyard was in a state of disunity because of her means before. Now, under the control of Ma'am Su Chui, the west courtyard was built with a solid wall, which revealed a sense of seriousness everywhere. "Son, what happened to you? How can you give the Jinyuan court to area? That place is reserved for my grandson. If you give it to Qinghao, I won't say anything." but Arya absolutely can't live there. After roughly understanding the current situation of the Su house, ma'am, Su Chui was so angry that she came to harass Su Huanli early in the morning, which annoyed Su Huanli. Besides, you don't like the women folk in your family to read and write. Why do you change your mind now? Zipei is so excellent, but you don't teach her. You have to teach that useless Arya. I am so angry. Ma'am, Su Chui didn't know what Zhu Yin said, but she disliked Su Li very much. Her impression of Su Li was still the ugly and thin dirty girl a few years ago. When ma'am, Su Chui thought that Su Arya, who looked like a beggar, lived in the magnificent Jinyuan court, she felt suffocated. Su Huanli smiled bitterly and said, Mother, Arya has changed her name. Now she is called Su Li. She is now the first talented woman in the Desu town. She is also the most beautiful woman. She is much better than Zipei. If she is not young, the matchmaker has already broken the threshold. Really? Is Arya as good as you said? Are you lying to me? Ma'am, Su Chui didn't believe it. Su Huanli nodded hard and said, Yes, mother. Yin can get out of bed now. I will arrange a reunion banquet for you tonight. I will also call the girl to come and see you. Okay, ma'am. Su Chui also knew that she couldn't defeat Su Huanli in a short time, so she could only nod and agree. Su Li came back in the evening and immediately received the news from the maid. She tidied up a little and said something to Mammy Li. Then she went to the main courtyard alone. Far outside the gate of the main courtyard, Su Li heard the laughter of Ma'am Su Chui, Zhu Yin, and Su Zipei. The atmosphere was very harmonious. When Su Li walked to the door, the room immediately became quiet. When Ma'am Su Chui saw Su Li now, she was so shocked that her mouth opened so wide that it could swallow a cow. She hadn't seen Su Li for a few years, but she was so beautiful. Her son didn't lie to her. Zhu Yin and Su Zipei's faces were gloomy at the same time, as if they saw their mortal enemy. Li Yuelian looked at the scene with a smile and didn't speak. As for Su Qinghao, he was concentrating on eating snacks and didn't notice the strange atmosphere. Su Li, greet Grandma. Su Li stepped forward and spoke gently. Her etiquette was as dignified as that of aristocratic families. Ma'am, Su Chui was shocked again. However, even so, Ma'am, Su Chui just nodded slightly. Her expression was extremely indifferent, and even a trace of disgust rose in her heart. You are really the same as what Yin said. Sometimes it was so difficult to understand the thoughts of the old people. They didn't distinguish right from wrong and judged people based on their subjective will. Since she was on Zhu Yan's side, she naturally trusted Zhu Yan's words and didn't think that Zhu Yan would lie to her. Since you are here, sit down. Su Li nodded gently and was about to sit down when she saw her seat. Ma'am, Su Chui suddenly scolded. Stop. Is that a seat you can sit on? Look carefully. Su Li stopped abruptly and raised her head with a puzzled look. There were important and secondary seats at the table. Ma'am, Su Chui sat on the highest seat, and then Su Huanli, Zhu Yin, Li Yuelian, Su Qinghao, Su Li, and Su Zipei in order. Su Huanli didn't come yet. There were 2 vacant seats. Su Li chose the second one. There was nothing wrong. But ma'am, Su Chui was wrong. Ma'am, Su Chui snorted coldly and said to Su Zipei with a pleasant face, Zipei, sit on the seat of your second sister. Su Zipei jumped up in surprise and said, Really, Grandma? Ma'am, Su Chui smiled kindly and said, Of course it's true. You little girl, I won't lie to you. Grandma, you are so nice. Su Zipei said sweetly and immediately moved to sit next to Su Qinghao. Su Qinghao wrinkled his nose and leaned to his mother without a trace. Because the third sister often bullied Su Li, he hated the third sister very much. After Su Zipei sat down, she didn't forget to show off to Su Li, but she saw that Su Li didn't sit down and didn't dare to move. She suddenly felt very happy in her heart. Su Li, even if you fascinated me, so what? There was still Grandma at home. Well, Arya, sit down. Ma'am, Su Chui looked at Su Li's well-behaved appearance and couldn't think of other ways to make things difficult for her. After all, tonight was the reunion dinner, and she didn't want to make her son unhappy. But Su Li let Zhu Yin miscarry that year. Today, she could sit at the main table and eat. She was really lucky. After a while, Su Huanli, who was busy with business, hurried in. When he saw the sitting order at the table, he was stunned. When he saw the eyes of Ma'am Su Chui, he suddenly understood something and smiled bitterly. He could only pretend that he didn't see it and sat down as if nothing had happened. Well, let's start the dinner. Ma'am Su Chui called, and the maids immediately began to serve the dishes. Of course, the food of the Su family was not bad. Suddenly, the hall was full of fragrance. Little Yin, you are pregnant now. Eat more to nourish your body. Thank you, Mom. Zipei, why are you so thin? Is it because you don't have enough nutrition recently? I'm going to eat this drumstick. And Qinghao, Grandma gives you the other drumstick. Thank you, Grandma. Su Zipei and Su Qinghao said at the same time. The dinner was lively. Ma'am Su Chui kept serving food to the younger generation. Most of the whole bowl of chicken soup was given to Zhu Yin. The 2 drumsticks were divided by Su Zipei and Su Qinghao. The wings were given to Su Huanli. Li Yuelian ate a piece of meat and drank half a bowl of soup. Chapter 54. Su Zipei nibbled the drumstick and looked at Su Li from time to time. She was very proud. Li Yuelian was also very angry. After so many years, the old woman was still so partial. Su Huanli couldn't bear it. When he was about to give a chicken wing in his bowl to Su Li, Ma'am Su Chui quickly stopped him and pressed it into the rice. She said, "You are busy with business. You need more nutrition. Eat it quickly." Su Huanli's lips squirmed. He looked at Ma'am Su Chui's warning eyes and finally sighed. Then he put the chicken wing into his mouth. Su Li sat on the edge of the table and ate the rice. The whole table was so big, but she couldn't even stretch her arms. Su Li really felt thirsty while eating. She picked up the spoon and wanted to drink some tofu soup. Slap. The spoon in her hand was slapped down by Ma'am Su Chui, who looked angry. Stinky girl, I give you food, but you still want to drink soup? I haven't entered the coffin yet. You are so disobedient. Do you want me to die early? Su Li shivered and quickly put down the bowl and chopsticks and knelt on the ground. Ma'am Su Chui still didn't give up. She covered her chest and cried, "Ouch! Huanli, look at the daughter you gave birth to. She has climbed over my head and caused the death of my grandson. She even dared to eat in front of me with a clear conscience. I am so angry. I am so dizzy." Su Huanli was shocked and quickly held Ma'am Su Chui, who was about to fall. Mother, don't scare me. I don't want to see her. I feel uncomfortable when I see her. Huanli, ask her to get out of here. Get out of here. No one could stop the old woman when she made a scene. Su Huanli was so angry that he couldn't stop his mother. He could only wave to Su Li and ask her to leave quickly. Su Li suppressed the killing intent in her chest and slowly left with her head down. Soon she disappeared in the night. As soon as Su Li left, Ma'am Su Chui immediately returned to normal and continued to pick food for Zhu Yin with a smile. Come on, my good wife. Eat more. Don't drink my grandson. After the banquet, Su Zipei felt refreshed. She took Zhu Yan's hand on the way and said happily, Mother, did you see that? That wicked girl was so scared that she was trembling. It was so funny. Li Yuelian watched Su Qinghao leave with a calm face. There seemed to be a volcano that was about to erupt in her heart. Like Su Li, she was extremely aggrieved. Finally, Ma'am Su Chui was happy and Su Huanli was not distressed at all. Su Li calmly watched them pass by one, and then returned to the Jinyuan court in the night. Miss, you're back. The food in the main courtyard must be delicious, right? Mammy Li heard the noise and came out with a smile. Su Li still smiled and nodded gently. Well, it's delicious. Even I want to poison it. The next morning, Su Li began to be busy as usual. No matter how Ma'am Su Chui cheated, Su Huanli would not hurt her temporarily for the benefit of the Su family. After sending off the last patient in the evening, Qi Xianqing came over and said with a smile, Disciple, your medical skills have been progressing rapidly recently. I've taught you everything I can. What you lack is only experience. From tomorrow on, I will officially hand over the Baichao Tang to you. Su Li was slightly stunned and blurted out, Master, are you leaving? Qi Xianqing nodded with a kind smile. I will leave for a few months. The war in the Northwest is tense. A doctor is benevolent and should save the dying and help the wounded. Don't worry. With my cultivation, there won't be any danger. Qi Xianqing said. He touched Su Li's hair and said, You are already 15 years old. I have been independent at your age. Believe in the affairs of the Su family. You can deal with it. You have to take good care of yourself when I leave. Su Li held her breath and immediately smiled. Master, don't worry. I won't lose your face. Remember, even if you are close to your relatives, you should be vigilant. Especially your parents. They are not kind people. Qi Xianqing warned her carefully and was worried. Your cultivation has reached a higher level. Ordinary people can't hurt you. I'm afraid that you are soft-hearted and hurt yourself. No matter how worried he was about his apprentice, Qi Xianqing still left the next day, leaving the Baiqiaotang, which only opened for a while at night. When people saw that the doctor in the Baiqiaotang was an extremely ordinary-looking woman, they couldn't help but doubt the former's medical skills. But under the repeated assurance of the waiter of the Baiqiaotang, someone was finally willing to have a try. After the try, they immediately found that the ordinary woman's medical skills were excellent. She almost cured the disease. She was not much different from Qi Xianqing. A few days later, they knew that the woman was the successor of Qi Xianqing. She had learned 70% or 80% of the medical skills at a young age. With the support of Ma'am Su Chui, Su Zipei became high-profile again these days. Every day, she either provoked Su Li or secretly tripped her up. Su Zipei didn't hide it at all. She skillfully confronted Su Li and didn't respond at all. Bitch. Don't think that my mother can't drive you out because you have the byway building. Su Zipei looked at Su Li leaving and said to herself resentfully. Without the daily morning class, Su Li still read books, but she had more time. On this day, when Su Li came back from the byway building to change clothes, she saw a group of guards of the Su family standing in front of the Jinyuan court. Mammy Li's shout came from inside. You can't do this. These are all the things of the miss. Su Li's expression changed slightly, and she immediately sped up and walked in. Stepping into the courtyard, she saw Mammy Li holding a small box and standing at the door aggrievedly. She watched a group of old mammies move boxes of cloth, silk, and books out of the house and throw them on the ground rudely. The ground had already been piled up into a hill. The clothes and bedding were mixed together. The poured ink immediately dyed them black. Every touch of the ink was stained. What's the matter? Su Li's voice was very light, but it was heard clearly by the guards. Grateful for Su Li's usual care, someone couldn't help but whisper immediately, It's the old lady. She said that the miss is not allowed to live in the house. Su Li narrowed her eyes slightly and walked over slowly. When the group of old mammies saw Su Li coming, they didn't stop but moved faster. Second miss, you can't blame us. This is the order of the old lady, and the master also agreed. The master said that you should move to the byway building. We are currently packing your luggage for you. Su Li looked at the dictionary of Dahan dyed black by the ink. Her eyes darkened, and she walked to Mammy Li. Mammy Li suddenly felt a chill, but she couldn't care so much at the moment. She immediately told Su Li what she had heard. It turned out that in order to predict the fate of Zhu Yan's baby, Ma'am Su Chui invited a witch for Zhu Yan. After the witch predicted Zhu Yan's fate, she was immediately scared and said intermittently that Su Li, who lived in the richest place in the west courtyard of the Su house, would bring bad luck to her younger brother. As long as Su Li stayed in the Su house for one day, the baby in Zhu Yan's belly would be suppressed and even become a stillborn baby. Such nonsense was simply ridiculous. Su Huanli couldn't believe it at all. But Ma'am Su Chui believed it. She remembered that Zhu Yan said that Su Li killed her grandson in the early years, and suddenly felt that what the witch said was very reasonable. She almost immediately asked Su Huanli to expel Su Li from the Su family. Of course, Su Huanli couldn't agree. What a joke. If Su Li was driven out of the Su family because of the witch's words, the Su family would be laughed at. Moreover, the byway building was a cash cow in Su Li's hands. How could he do something that would damage his interests? Seeing that her son couldn't agree, Ma'am Su Chui was so angry that she went crazy. Finally, Zhu Yan said that Su Li could live outside the Su house, and it would be almost the same. Su Huanli thought it was a good idea, so that Su Li wouldn't have a conflict with her mother at home. He agreed, but he didn't expect that ma'am. Su Chui's way of asking Su Li to go out was so barbaric. Su Li slowly walked to the messy luggage and squatted down. She began to clean it up silently. Mammy Li felt sad and said, "Miss, let me help you." At this moment, there was nothing left in the Jinyuan court. A group of old mammies stopped and looked at Su Li's embarrassing appearance. They wanted to laugh at her. Suddenly, more than a dozen guards in light armor moved and protected in front of Su Li and Mammy Li. The tall human wall exuded a vigorous atmosphere, which immediately made the group of old mammies feel stressed. They shrank and dared not to talk nonsense. Suzy Pei, who was peeping outside, saw this scene and immediately became angry. More than a dozen guards automatically protected their master. Even she had never enjoyed this kind of treatment. Why should Su Li be loved by others? At this time, Su Li had cleaned up the quilt that was splashed with ink. She stretched out her white hands. A young guard couldn't stand it and immediately grabbed the quilt before her. His hands were dyed black. He said, "Miss, let me help you." Su Li was stunned and immediately smiled. She asked, "What's your name?" The young man immediately blushed and said hesitantly, I have no name. Everyone calls me Xiaojiu." "Xiaojiu?" Su Li smiled and nodded. "Thank you." Xiaojiu's face was as red as blood instantly. He followed Su Li at a loss and his mind was full of one sentence. Miss actually said thank you to him. Then another guard helped Su Li to carry the heavy bookcase. A group of people protected Su Li and went away. "Ma'am." Su Chui didn't even prepare a carriage for her. But with the help of this group of guards, Su Li didn't feel troublesome. After putting all the things in the guest room of the Baiwei building, Su Li turned around and gave some money to everyone. "Miss, we can't take the money. We all know your situation in the Su family." Xiaojiu quickly refused. Su Li sighed and shook her head. "You all take it. You helped me today. The old lady and my mother will definitely make trouble for you. You'd better go out with Butler Li for a few days. You can live a comfortable life if you have more money on the road." Xiaojiu and others heard it and suddenly became silent. It turned out that Miss saw it more clearly than any of them. Why did such a kind-hearted Miss have to be bullied by the old lady and the first lady? It was so unreasonable. Su Li glanced at Xiaojiu and others. These guards were relatively young. They were only 1 or 2 years older than Su Li. It was said that they were all good helpers trained by Li Yin. Now it seemed that the old butler's temperament was moderate. If the selfish Su Huanli trained them, they would be full of bad ideas. That night, Fang Yuan and Chu Qingning got the news and hurried to the Baiwei building. "What ghost? I'm going to kill her." Chu Qingning was furious and turned around to kill people, but he was stopped by Fang Yuan. "Su Li, what do you think? If you want to make the ghost disappear, we will do it immediately." Fang Yuan couldn't help it. Su Li helped them so much, but now she was bullied like this. If they didn't do something, how could they be worthy of Su Li? "No need." Su Li shook her head slowly and said, "You two need to change your temperament. How can you kill people so easily?" Chu Qingning scratched his head and thought that although Su Li was a poison master, she was still kind-hearted. Fang Yuan didn't think like Chu Qingning. He heard Su Li's words. Chapter 55. Chu Qingning widened his eyes and felt cold. He stared at Su Li's slightly raised lips. Although her appearance didn't change, he felt that the one standing in front of him was not a kind-hearted girl, but a capricious female devil. Illusion? Chu Qingning shook his head and looked at Su Li. She didn't smile anymore. It was an illusion. Without Su Li, the Su house became very harmonious. There were no more contradictions. Su Li was happy to live in the Baiwei building. It was more convenient for her to go to the Baichaotang after dressing up. After Zhu Yin recovered, the room was full of tonics bought by Ma'am Su Chui, but she still felt uncomfortable. She tried hard to bribe the witch, but Su Li only changed a place to live, which made her very unwilling. It also made her clearly realize that if she couldn't separate Su Li from the Baiwei building, she couldn't drive Su Li out of the Su family. But Su Li used her cooking skills as a bond. It was impossible for Su Huanli to let Su Li leave the Baiwei building. This wicked girl. I have never seen her cook before. How can she be so good at cooking? Zhu Yin bit her lips with hatred. She was now in a dead end. Fortunately, Su Qingtan would come back in a year. She had enough time to come up with a solution. Time passed slowly when Su Li constantly improved her medical skills and Fang Yuan and Chu Qingning built the yard in full swing. Nothing special happened for a whole month. Zhu Yan's belly was slightly bulging. She temporarily became the most important person in the Su family. Ma'am, Su Chui almost surrounded Zhu Yan every day. During this period, Su Li disguised as a man and made a transaction with Su Huanli at the Sanhe Bridge. This was the third transaction after she stole the seasoning. Except for the 90,000 taels spent on building the yard and purchasing a large amount of polished glutinous rice and other raw materials, there were 60,000 taels left. Qi Xianqing still didn't come back. Su Li didn't know which battlefield he went to, but the war was always long. It was impossible to end in a month. She estimated that Qi Xianqing would stay there for at least half a year. In my previous life, I suffered in the Su family and was blocked from news. I don't know which country Dahan country is fighting with now. All kinds of thoughts flashed through Su Li's mind. The territory of Dahan country was not small. It was bordered by 3 countries. The Qinghe province was located in the southernmost part of Dahan country and adjacent to Nanjiang country. The Zhushou country was located in the northeast, and the Tianhe country was famous for its mechanism skills. Fang Yuan and Chu Qingning both fled from Nanjiang. It was reasonable to say that the Nanjiang country should be in chaos. However, the Desu town was not far from the border, but it was calm without any atmosphere of war. Therefore, Su Li speculated that the main battlefield was not here. Standing on the top floor of the byway building overlooking the boundless night, Su Li sighed softly. In this busy and peaceful month, her cultivation had reached the complete foundation of Hotian Realm Level 9, and her aura was extremely smooth. She was just a step away from entering the Xiantian realm. If the technique was perfected, it would only be a matter of time before one reached Hotian Realm Level 9. However, if one wanted to cross the chasm and reach the innate realm, it would depend on one's aptitude. Some people with mediocre aptitude might not be able to break through in their entire lives. They would be stuck at the limit of their lifespan. With her aptitude, she would not be stuck at the limit. Even if she went astray in her previous life, she still stepped into the innate realm or even a higher realm. Unfortunately, the price she paid was too high. In the end, she was plotted against by Su Zipei and ended up in such a miserable situation. On the 7th day of Su Li's efforts to break through, Chu Qingning finally came to her. The yard was finally built. When she came to the valley, Su Li saw that the space of the valley had been expanded by 3 times. She couldn't help but praise him. She turned back and smiled. "Thank you for your hard work. Have a good rest these days." When Chu Qingning heard the meaningful words, he couldn't help but smile bitterly. In the past month, he was tormented by the poisonous heart-biting insect. However, to his surprise, his cultivation had not regressed. Instead, it had made great progress and his foundation was much more stable than before. This made him doubt Su Li's real intention, but he felt that it was impossible. After all, Su Li was not from Nanjiang. Even if she had heard of the poisonous heart-biting insect, it was impossible for her to know it better than him. At this moment, Su Li had gone far and stood in front of the gate of the yard. It cost tens of thousands of taels of silver to build this yard. The materials used were all superior, which was more expensive than the Jinyuan court. The area was 5 times larger than that of the Jinyuan court, which was enough to accommodate 100 people. "Sister Su Li." Fang Ling ran over and hugged Su Li at once. "I chose the furniture in these rooms. Do you like it?"
Yes.
Su Li smiled gently. Since she moved to Su Li's place, Fang Ling had kept up with nutrition. She grew a lot taller and her skin became white. She looked mischievous, which was really lovable. Su Li thought like this, but she didn't realize that she was only 15 years old now. Compared with Fang Ling, she was only 2 or 3 years older. Miss, you are here." Haydn and others swarmed from the yard. They worked very hard in the past month, but because they ate well, they all became strong, not as skinny and sallow as before. How about it? Although these boys haven't gone to school, they are very hardworking. Chu Qingning followed and said with a smile. Su Li nodded slightly and said, "Not bad, but far from my requirements. These days are free. You can pass on the practice methods of your Chu family and collect more things on the list. If they are collected, I will start to refine medicine to speed up their practice. Su Li's understatement shocked Chu Qingning so much that his eyes almost popped out. You can refine elixirs? Chu Qingning pointed at Su Li and said after a while, aren't you a poison master? How can you refine elixirs? You are younger than me. Since ancient times, medicine and poison are inseparable. You talk too much. Su Li was a little impatient and said, time is pressing. Pass on the practice methods quickly. The group of little beggars standing in the courtyard watched the two of them talk. They were all confused and had no idea what this conversation meant to them. Ling, teach them to read more in the future. Illiteracy is really a trouble. Su Li told Fong Ling again. This time, the little beggars understood and their eyes lit up. Could it be that they could also read and write like those officials? 1 month ago, they didn't even dare to think about such a good thing. After handing over the trifles, Su Li finally began to do business. She asked Haydn to take out a bag of polished glutinous rice and poured it into a basin to wash it. After soaking it for 2 hours, Fang Yuan came back from the Baiwei building and was shocked when he saw the scene. Was Su Li going to cook a new dish? Now almost everything in the Baiwei building was managed by Fang Yuan. Although shopkeeper Wu was still there, Su Li caught his secret of hiding money. In order not to be sent to the government office, he could only follow Su Li's order and pretend to help cover up the truth in the restaurant. After solving the problem of shopkeeper Wu, Su Li had already taken over the Baiwei building. However, Su Li didn't make false accounts and gave all the profits to the Su family, which made Fang Yuan very confused. What are you thinking about? Come and help me. At this time, Su Li's voice came. Fang Yuan immediately woke up and quickened his pace to run over. Su Li waved to Haydn and said, go to your eldest brother to learn Kung Fu, in case you fall behind. Haydn now knew what Kung Fu was. He immediately nodded and ran away happily. Is Chu Qingning teaching Haydn and others the family practice method? That boy always abides by the rules of the family. Fang Yuan was surprised. Su Li glanced at him and said nothing. Fang Yuan was silent for a moment and held his breath. Yes, the Chu family was gone. Why did Chu Qingning keep it a secret? Did he want to die alone? Not to mention Chu Qingning, even Fang Yuan was the same. I remember that the practice method of the Chu family is open to both men and women. Su Li, why don't you? Su Li was slightly stunned and immediately shook her head with a smile. Ling can learn it, but I don't. Fang Yuan frowned slightly and said, you don't want to learn it? Although the practice method of the Chu family is not the best, it is also an extremely rare second-grade practice method in the martial arts circle. If you learn it, you can reach the acquired first hurdle and protect yourself. Su Li still shook her head and didn't want to dwell on this topic too much. Fang Yuan knew that Su Li was extremely stubborn and could only sigh in his heart. He gave up the thought of persuading her and looked at the polished glutinous rice in the water. You bought a whole warehouse of polished glutinous rice and a lot of distilling yeast. Are you going to make wine this time? It was not difficult for Fang Yuan to guess what Su Li wanted to do from the things she bought before. But the wine on the market had already been saturated, and there were countless wineries. Even if Su Li used the more expensive polished glutinous rice to make wine, it was only a little better than those wines. The cost was much higher than the gain. Why do you ask so much? Come and help me. Su Li didn't answer. Fang Yuan was very helpless, but he was also used to Su Li's keeping him in suspense. He walked over and fished out the polished glutinous rice. According to Su Li's instructions, he poured it into the steamer with cloth and spread it evenly. Boom! The fire was burning in the hearth. As time went by, bursts of rice fragrance came out. About an hour later, Su Li asked Fang Yuan to stop. She took out all the polished glutinous rice to cool, added the distilling yeast and stirred it evenly. Then she put it into a small jar and spread it flat with her hands. Soon there was no jar. Next, you and Qingning pay more attention to the wine jar. If there is wine, you can taste it. The taste of the wine can't be too sour. When it is sweet or sour, call me. Su Li instructed carefully. Fang Yuan firmly remembered and didn't dare to miss a word. Although the polished glutinous rice used this time was very little, it was still hundreds of taels of silver. He was not a wasteful person. After finishing the business of the wine jar, Suli hurried to the Baijiaotang and began to see patients. Although it was a little later than usual, the waiting time was acceptable. Until midnight, the last patient left. Suli stretched herself and looked at the dark night outside. She moved the door plank and was about to close the door and leave. Suddenly, the smell of blood assailed her nose. A resistance stopped her from closing the door. Suli's pupil shrank slightly, and she looked down. Chapter 56. The night was as cold as water, and the smell of blood in the air was much stronger. Suli looked at the figure lying on the ground with his head facing the ground. She didn't know whether he was dead or alive. She was never a good person. This person was seriously injured and dying, but he could still exert so much strength to stop her from closing the door. He was definitely not an ordinary person. If she got involved in it for no reason, it might be a big trouble. Thinking of this, she squatted down and opened the hand on the side of the door. She shook it off with disgust. When she was about to close the door, she glimpsed a crystal on the wrist of the former. This crystal immediately made Suli tremble all over, and her face was no longer indifferent. Without saying a word, she carefully flipped the bloody man over and revealed his face. At this time, the clouds cleared and the moon appeared. The bright moonlight sprinkled on the bloody face of the young man. Suli breathed hard. Even if the face became more embarrassed, she could recognize it at a glance. How could it be? Was it because of this in the previous life that his legs were disabled? Anxiety appeared on Suli's face, but her heart was unusually calm as ice. She roughly checked that the latter was still alive. Regardless of the blood on the young man's body, she immediately dragged him into the Baijiaotang. In just a few minutes, there was a very rough knock on the door of the Baijiaotang. Before Suli went to open the door suddenly burst with a bang. In the flying sawdust, two figures, one tall and one short, were reflected. The breath of the inborn realm was released arrogantly, and the air wave immediately swept the room into disorder. Suli stood by the door and groaned. She forced a mouthful of blood to spit out. Then she fell into the broken wood and pretended to faint. The blood fell on the ground and reflected red plum blossoms. When the tall middle-aged man saw this scene, he immediately shook his head. Second brother was still so wicked. He even didn't let go of a mortal little doctor. The short man in a black robe squinted his triangular eyes and laughed sinisterly. That boy was plotted against by Lord Ming. He was seriously injured and almost died. He must be hiding here. The tall middle-aged man also nodded slightly. Even if he is not the hierarch of the Enma cult, he must have a close relationship with the Enma cult. Catch him and show him to Lord Ming. After the two of them finished their brief conversation, they immediately split up to search the 100-herb hall. Not long after, the entire 100-herb hall looked like it had been hit by a typhoon. Medicinal herbs and prescriptions were scattered everywhere. Half a quarter of an hour later, a short, black-robed man walked out with a flustered and exasperated look on his face. He shrieked, "Damn it! I clearly smelled the scent of blood and came over here. How could there not be any?" The tall, middle-aged man's face darkened. Maybe this is a trap set by this little bastard. This is a medical center. He won't walk right into our trap. We've made a mistake. Hurry up and chase after him. I have never been toyed with like this before. The short, black-robed man was so angry that his voice was hoarse and unpleasant to the ears like a crow. He glanced at Suli, who was lying in a coma in the sawdust, and swallowed a mouthful of saliva. He wanted to catch the little bastard and enjoy her. Damn it, hurry up and leave. If you lose him and Lord Ming blames you, be careful that you don't cut that thing off. The tall, middle-aged man clearly knew the black-robed man very well and warned him. The short, black-robed man snorted and shot a poisonous dart into Suli's neck. Then he turned around and left with the tall, middle-aged man. Of course, if Suli didn't use the nothing unusual, it might be another result. The two disappeared in front of the door, but Suli didn't get up. She still lay motionless on the ground. After another hour, the tall, middle-aged man returned and stepped into the Baijiaotang. He glanced at Suli, who was lying on the ground, dead for a long time, and carefully checked the traces on the ground. After confirming that no one left after they left, he shook his head disappointedly and floated away. As soon as the tall, middle-aged man left, Suli immediately opened her eyes. She didn't have time to pull out the poisonous dart on her neck. She rolled up and cleared the sawdust under her body. A hidden doorknob immediately appeared. Opening the cellar door, Suli carried the boy out on her back and laid him flat on the ground. She knocked open his mouth and gave him a healing elixir refined by herself. After the elixir was dissolved in his body, she was relieved and had time to check the boy's injury. After a while, Suli raised her head and frowned. Although there are many injuries and his right leg is fractured, fortunately, there are no broken bones, so it is not difficult to treat. But his tendons and veins are broken in many places, and his internal injury is extremely serious. He is also poisoned, and the toxicity is unknown. I am afraid that I need to go to the bamboo building to make up the antidote. Suli frowned more and more tightly. At this time, the boy suddenly coughed violently twice. His childish but angular face showed a bit of pain. Then his eyelashes trembled and he opened his eyes. I am still alive? The boy's throat was sweet, and his whole body was in severe pain. Suddenly, he felt a softness at the back of his head. He struggled to raise his head and found that he was lying on a girl's lap. It was her. The boy's eyes opened slightly and showed a bit of brightness. He didn't know why, but he had never cared so much about a woman. Especially now, he was running for his life and thought that he would die, but he was saved by her by chance. Suddenly, the boy thought of something, and his bloodless face became paler. He struggled to sit up. I can't stay here. You should also run away quickly. They have killed countless people and will not leave anyone alive. This movement immediately affected his internal injury, and a mouthful of red blood gushed from his throat. Suli was annoyed and pressed down the boy's body. She said in a very angry tone, "If you move again, don't blame me if you die." Her voice was not as sweet as usual, but hoarse and unpleasant. The boy was stunned at once, and he found that there was still a poisonous dart in Suli's neck. They had already been here. The boy was shocked. Did she protect him? But Heikuei's poisonous dart sealed the throat immediately. What was going on now? At this time, he saw Suli pull out the poisonous dart in her neck. Black blood immediately flowed from the wound, but it didn't take long for the blood to turn red. Obviously, the poison had been detoxified. In an instant, Suli's image in the boy's eyes became mysterious. Except for the pressure of the inborn senior, Suli felt a little tightness in her chest, but she didn't suffer much injury. After confirming that the boy was temporarily safe, she slightly tidied up the Baichao Tang, and then carried the boy on her back and ran along the vast night road to the valley. Lying on Suli's back, the boy had an unprecedented mood. From childhood to adulthood, except for his mother, it seemed that no woman had carried him like this. The night wind was slightly cool, and Suli slightly raised the corner of her mouth. It seemed that she had traveled through time and space and returned to her previous life. In her previous life, she also carried her disabled husband like this, and she didn't know how many sceneries and hardships they had gone through. On the mountain path, fireflies were flying. The boy's mood had never been so calm. He looked at the girl's weak shoulder, hesitated for a moment, and asked softly, "What is your name?" Suli said without hesitation. "This was the name you gave me in the previous life, but in this life, I have to tell you personally." Suli. The boy's face was pale, but his smile was soft. "What a coincidence. I also have the word Li, and my name is..." "What?" Suli suddenly stopped. Before the boy finished his words, his face had changed. Two horrible Numas rose in front of the road. The boy and Suli were very familiar with these two Numas. They were the two killers, one tall and one short. Hey, little girl. You really faked your death. No wonder I felt something wrong with the poisonous dart." The short man in a black robe walked over with a ghostly atmosphere and laughed. "Are you the holy girl of the Enma cult? I'm really disappointed. The holy girl of the Enma cult looks so ordinary." The tall, middle-aged man also walked out of the shadow, and the long knife at his waist had been unsheathed, shining with cold light. Suli's eyes slightly sank. She gently put down the boy and whispered, "You stay here and don't move." The boy's face was faintly anxious, and he quickly said in a deep voice, "Run away quickly. Don't worry about me. The elders of the blood refining hall are all inborn seniors, and you are no match for them." Su Li turned a deaf ear to him, and her pneuma stagnated for a moment. Then she suddenly rushed out, and the direction of the two elders was obviously to die. "Idiot!" The short man in a black robe sneered and waved his sleeves. Countless poisonous darts immediately flew out of his sleeves, like a rain of flowers. The boy's pupils contracted, and he was about to rush forward regardless of his upper body. But Su Li suddenly disappeared for a moment, and then appeared behind the man in a black robe. The man in a black robe looked slightly changed, and he immediately propped up the vital energy for the protection of his body. He was confident that even if he was sneak attacked, Su Li's cultivation of acquired ninth hurdle couldn't break his vital energy for the protection of his body. "I should be fooled by a silly little girl." The tall middle-aged man was unhappy, and he sneered. He immediately stepped forward, and his figure flickered. A bright knife radiance was aimed at Su Li's forehead. For a moment, the sand and stones were flying, and the knife radiance hit the ground, making a loud bang. "Silly little girl, who doesn't know the immensity of heaven and earth, dares to fight against the blood-refining hall with such a low cultivation?" The tall middle-aged man had a well-thought-out plan. He brandished his saber and chopped the dust away. He was extremely confident in his saber skills. That feeling just now was definitely a hit. In the future, his physical body under the heavens would still end up in pieces. The man in a black robe was teased, and he was depressed, but he still came over and praised, "Eldest brother, you are awesome." The tall, middle-aged man snorted, and he was about to teach him a lesson, but there was a strange sound behind him. He looked back in amazement and saw Su Li's head was bleeding, but she didn't die. His face was extremely ugly. "And no matter how hard you struggle, you can't escape death." The tall middle-aged man was extremely angry. He stepped out and was about to cut down again, but he suddenly felt that he stepped on something, and a gloomy, killing intention immediately shrouded him. Su Li squinted her eyes, and blood flowed from her forehead. A cold smile appeared at the corner of her mouth. "Even if I can't beat you, I can still poison you." Boom! The place where Su Li stepped on just now collapsed, and it was 7 feet deep. The two elders of the blood refining hall couldn't avoid it, and they fell into it one after another. "Insignificant skill," the tall middle-aged man roared. Just as he was about to fly out of the hole, the surrounding soil seemed to have come to life, burying the two of them alive at lightning speed. Then, the originally soft soil actually became as hard as iron and stone, leaving only the two heads exposed. "What's that?" The short man screamed in horror, and he couldn't move. His body was trapped underground, and he couldn't use any means. The tall middle-aged man would be even more miserable. His knife was also imprisoned underground, and he couldn't use it even if he had great cultivation. Su Li lay on the side of the head, panting, and couldn't use any strength. The movement just now seemed easy, but in fact it was her limit. If these two people weren't careless, she was likely to fail. The teenager stared blankly at what happened, and he didn't expect that the situation would be reversed in just a few seconds. The seemingly weak figure actually buried two inborn seniors alive in minutes. Even if he told this situation to his subordinates, no one would believe it. Thinking of this, the teenager struggled to walk over with one foot. Su Li propped up her body and took out 2 black porcelain bottles from her arms. When the two inborn seniors saw this scene, they couldn't calm down anymore, and they closed their mouths. The teenager came over, frowned slightly, and said, "They don't have the protective genuine chi, but they still have strength. In our current state, we can't open their mouths." Su Li smiled sweetly, opened a bottle, and said, "You cover your nose quickly." The teenager's expression changed, and it seemed that what he said was not difficult for her at all. Su Li covered her nose and put the black porcelain bottle in front of the tall, middle-aged man. The middle-aged man suddenly felt itchy in his nose. He was extremely frightened and immediately held his breath to stop the smell. But how long could he hold his breath? The middle-aged man's face was red, and he was about to pass out. Finally, he couldn't bear it anymore. Chapter 57. At the moment when the tall, middle-aged man sneezed, Suli flicked her fingers and sent a black pill into the middle-aged man's mouth. The poison penetrated his intestines. The middle-aged man only screamed. His face turned black at a speed visible to the naked eye, and he died. Then the corpse made a sound. In the blink of an eye, there were only clothes left and no bones. Seeing this scene, the black-robed man was scared out of his wits. A chill immediately rushed from the soles of his feet to the top of his skull. This way of death was too strange and miserable. Thinking that he would suffer this kind of pain soon, he immediately howled, "Don't kill me! What do you want to know? I will tell you all. Don't kill me!" The black-robed man howled and cried with snot flying. He didn't look like an elder of the blood-refining hall at all. The teenager looked serious and motioned Suli to stop. He asked in a cold voice, "Who is the traitor hiding in the Enma cult? Who exposed my whereabouts?" The black-robed man widened his eyes and said tremblingly, "It turns out that you are the hierarch of the Enma cult, the unfathomable childly in the legend of Jianghu. It is incredible that you are less than 20 years old." Then, the black-robed man sighed and said, "Hierarch, I will tell you all I know, but please leave me an intact corpse. Don't let me die without an intact corpse like Elder Gao." "I promise." Suli did not hesitate and put away the black porcelain bottle. The black-robed man immediately breathed a sigh of relief and said, "I think after this plot, Hierarch should have guessed that the traitor is Zhao Ming, the person in charge of the border branch. In fact, he is not a traitor. He was originally an undercover of the blood refining hall. Under his infiltration, the entire border branch betrayed us." "I see." The teenager sighed softly. "No wonder. My hunch is right. I don't feel anything when I go to the Shuelo cult. Once I go to the border branch, I feel uncomfortable all over." "The poison that Zhaoming gave to you is the unique blood poison of the blood refining hall. If you don't cure it in time, you may end up as a disabled person. Hierarch, you should be careful." The black-robed man tried his best to say, "That's all I know. I don't have the blood poison antidote. Hierarch, please let me go with peace of mind." The teenager nodded and patted on the black-robed man's head. The black-robed man's eyes, ears, nose, and mouth immediately bled and died. Sure enough, he kept his promise and left the corpse intact. "Suli, let's go." The young man took a deep breath and regained his smile, as if what he had just heard did not affect him at all. "I haven't told you my name. My name is—" Suli waved her hand to stop the teenager. The teenager's expression was slightly stiff. His name was a great secret, but he didn't expect that he was stopped when he wanted to tell Suli. Thinking of this, Suli took out a white porcelain bottle out of nowhere and poured something like clear water on the black-robed man who was already dead. Pist pist. As soon as the clear water melted, it immediately corroded everything like a strong acid. In the blink of an eye, half of the black-robed man's head had melted away, revealing the eerie white bones within. "Ah!" Suddenly, the already dead black-robed man opened his eyes and let out an extremely ear-piercing scream. However, the poisonous water quickly corroded his eyeballs and throat, and his voice became completely silent. The headless body trembled for a long time before it completely stopped. In the end, it slowly melted, and not even the clothes were left. The teenager swallowed a mouthful of saliva. He saw Suli put away the porcelain bottle, and a flowery smile appeared on her pale face. "I heard that the blood refining hall has a method of feigning death, which can withstand a fatal blow. I didn't expect it to be true. Now you can tell me your name." The autumn wind swept over, bringing a little coolness, and also blowing into the teenager's heart. But he also felt inexplicably warm. If there was no Suli, when the black-robed man got out of the trap by feigning death, he would definitely die. "My name is Lingli, which means Ling of Heaven and Li of Separation." Suli smiled and squinted her eyes like a crescent moon. She said, "Lingli, I like this name." The child in front of her, with a pale face, was so familiar, just like him in the previous life. The teenager's face instantly turned red. After a hard fight, Su Li carried the exhausted Ling Li to the bamboo building. It was already late at night. Fang Yuan heard the noise and walked out. When he saw Su Li covered with blood, he was suddenly shocked and said, "What happened? Su Li, are you okay?" Ling Li saw Fang Yuan and squinted his eyes. He was from the poisonous insect clan. "I'm fine." A wounded person came to the Bai Chao Tang, and he was highly poisoned. "I have to be sure to make the antidote in the bamboo building." As Su Li said, she touched the wound on her forehead and said with a smile, "It's just a minor injury. I fell down and got hurt." Fang Yuan was inexplicably distressed. He quickly helped Su Li to put down Ling Li without looking at him, because he felt that this person exuded an inexplicable hostility. "I'm afraid that Su Li saved a troublemaker." Fang Yuan sighed secretly. He helped Su Li carry Ling Li to the second floor and put him on the bed. Looking at the bottles and cans in the room and smelling the unique fragrance of a girl, Fang Yuan blushed and said in a low voice, "Do you need help?" He looked at Ling Li's bloodstains, some of which were already brown. Su Li smiled and shook her head. "Don't worry and go to sleep. Doctors don't care about these things." Fang Yuan thought that Su Li must have a lot of contacts in the Bai Chao Tang. He couldn't help but scratch his head and said, "That's right. I won't bother you. You can make the antidote at ease." Then he closed the door, but he didn't go to sleep. Instead, he called Chu Qingning up and they went outside to investigate. Su Li suddenly brought back a person of unknown origin, which was likely to bring disaster to the valley. But they didn't know that the two inborn seniors who could kill all the people in the valley had been buried in the wilderness by Su Li. At this moment, in the room on the second floor of the bamboo building, the atmosphere was inexplicably awkward. Ling Li was lying on the white bed. Bursts of fragrance came into his nose. He didn't know that it was Su Li's bed. His face became redder. At this time, Su Li brought a basin of water and put it on the side of the bed. Then she tore most of the rags on Ling Li's body without saying anything. Ling Li immediately panicked and rushed to the foot of the bed like a monkey. He stammered like a little wife and asked, What are you going to do?" He had lived 2 lives and had never been so embarrassed. He was forced to be undressed by a woman he knew for only 1 day. Su Li looked unhappy and frowned. She said coldly, "You are covered with blood. How can I cure you? If you don't want to lose all your cultivation, behave yourself." Ling Li suddenly froze. After a long time, he lay down like a robot, resigned to his fate, like a fish on the chopping board. Of course, he heard the words of the black-robed man. If he didn't detoxify, he was likely to lose his cultivation. And Su Li just said that she was sure to make the poison. If he could recover to his heyday, this shame was nothing. Su Li picked up the towel and wiped the boy's thick chest. Her eyes were indescribably gentle. "It was good to do it like in the previous life. In the previous life, I also wiped your body like this, husband." After an hour, Su Li finally cleaned the blood on Ling Li's body, revealing countless knife and sword wounds. This time, Ling Li did escape from death. He escaped from dozens of killers in the border branch. He was almost covered with cuts and bruises. After applying the ointment to Ling Li, Su Li also felt a little tired. If she made the medicine in this state, she couldn't guarantee that there would be no mistakes. She applied some medicine to her forehead and turned back. "I will test the poison for you tomorrow. You can rest well today." Then, Su Li closed the door without hesitation and left. Looking at the dim light in the room, Ling Li was almost tied up like a mummy, but he was cool all over. The wounds were no longer burning. The poison in his body was also suppressed by him. It didn't cause trouble for the time being. Only his tendons and veins were aching. "I don't know if Lingamo got the news," Ling Li sighed and closed his eyes. But his mind was full of the wound on Su Li's neck. The weak figure stood in front of him and fought desperately for him. "You and I don't know each other. Why do you risk your life to save me?" In the morning of the next day, people in the Desu town saw the ruined Bai Chao Tang. They were suddenly in a mess and worried about Su Li's safety. But Su Li usually appeared at night. They could only help Su Li clean up the medicine cabinet and wait for her to come back. Who is so heartless to steal the money of the Bai Chao Tang? Evil thief. If you dare to steal the medicine of the Bai Chao Tang, be careful of diseases. I heard that the Nanjiang country is very chaotic recently. Is it done by the refugees of the Nanjiang country? Alas, the world is really chaotic. Let's not talk about the comments among people for the time being. At this moment, Suli was also entangled by someone and asked about the wound on her forehead. Second miss, what's the matter with the wound on your head? He sure looked at the white cloth on Suli's head distressed and said, if there is a scar, it will not look good. Suli touched her forehead and smiled. It doesn't matter. It's just a fall. It's a minor injury. It will be fine in 2 days. That's good. He sure breathed a sigh of relief and said, I heard that the new female doctor of the Baichao Tang is very powerful. Miss, you can go to see her. Maybe there will be no scar. But I heard that the Baichao Tang was robbed. I don't know how the female doctor is. Su Li's eyes flashed and she said, then I will go to see her at night. After dealing with the affairs of the Baichao Tang, Su Li immediately returned to the valley. She saw Ling Li lying on the rattan chair in the yard and basking in the sun. It seemed that his injury was much better and he could walk. Hierarch of the Enma cult, childly, Su Li muttered to herself and walked over. As early as in the previous life, she should have thought that the destruction of the Enma cult and the disappearance and appearance of her disabled husband almost happened at the same time. Speaking of the crime of treason, the hierarch of the Enma cult certainly could bear it. The imperial court almost dreamed of wiping out the forces of the Enma cult in the martial arts circle. She was called the female devil in the previous life and bore the brunt. Seeing Su Li coming in, Ling Li turned his head and smiled, showing 2 sharp canine teeth. You are here. If the people of the Enma cult and the Shuelo cult saw this smile, they would be so shocked that their eyeballs would fall out. Childly, who only knew how to fake, sneer, and evil smile, could also smile so warmly and softly. She saw that Haydn and other little beggars were squatting in the yard with bare arms. Chu Qingning was not around. Haydn looked at Chu Qingning from time to time. He even worshipped Chu Qingning. Are you teaching them Xiangong? Su Li asked in surprise. Ling Li nodded with a smile and said, I have received such a great favor from you. I have to show something. Su Li's face immediately became cold and her voice was cold. Do you think that I saved you because I want to repay you? Ling Li was stunned and didn't know how to explain. Before he opened his mouth, Su Li had already snorted coldly and turned to leave the yard. He was annoyed and immediately chased after her. Haydn laughed and said, Boss Ling must be interested in Sister Li. As soon as Haydn said that, some people were not convinced and said, Humph, we all know it. We are not fools. Yes, yes. Boss Ling's life is saved by Sister Su Li. Of course, he should devote himself to her. The little beggars took it for granted, but Haydn was lost in thought and said, This is troublesome. If Sister Li likes Boss Ling, what about our boss? Yes, yes, our boss doesn't have a wife either. Don't forget that Boss Fong is here. Wow, it's so messy. Let's leave it alone. A group of little boys were chattering. Chu Qingning, who was hiding outside the yard, heard these words and suddenly became speechless. These silly boys were really ignorant and fearless. Although the boy brought back by Su Li seemed to be only a few years older than them, his pneuma was really horrible. He only saw it from the elders of the family. If they really fought, he was afraid that he couldn't take one move. It was still under the premise that the boy was seriously injured. What is the background of the boy brought back by Su Li? He should be a young master. Is he the crown prince of a country? Chapter 58. Ling Li followed Su Li all the way to the 2nd floor of the bamboo building. He wanted to explain, but found that he didn't know how to explain. Su Li saw that Ling Li didn't say a word. She looked colder and said sarcastically, Why don't you continue to repay the kindness? Why do you go upstairs with me? Ling Li was inexplicably ridiculed when he helped her. He couldn't help but get angry. He said coldly, I really want to repay the kindness by teaching them. Even the members of the cult are rarely qualified to practice those martial arts. Why are you angry? Hierarch, you must be joking. I'm just a common person in the Desu town. How dare I be angry with you? Su Li looked indifferent and grabbed a long-haired spider from the jar. She said, Xingong is precious. I can't repay you. I can only help you to test the antidote. Ling Li looked at the colorful spider in Su Li's hand, which was bigger than his fist. He suddenly broke into a cold sweat. Could this last be seizing the opportunity to take revenge? What? You are the hierarch of the Enma cult. Don't you even have the courage to test the poison? Or are you afraid of being poisoned by me? Although he knew that Su Li was goading him, Ling Li was surprisingly uncomfortable. He snorted and sat on the edge of the bed. He said calmly, "Let's start." In his previous life, he had gone through mountains of knives and fires, and even hell. How could he be afraid of a poisonous spider? Seeing that Ling Li was ready, Su Li patted the abdomen of the spider gently. The spider immediately spat out a spider silk and went deep into Ling Li's throat. It was like a small snake swimming through his internal organs. Ling Li felt extremely disgusted. He couldn't help but swallow, but he still resisted swallowing. After a short while, it was almost time. Su Li let the spider take back the spider silk. The white and transparent spider silk had become dark. Some places were colorful, which was very strange. Ling Li was frightened. He had a little knowledge of poison. What was the blood poison in his body? It could be divided into so many different kinds of poisons. Su Li cut the spider silk and put it back in the jar. Then she took out a knife and carefully peeled off the poison. He took a small portion of it and poured it into a transparent glass bottle. Then, he poured a few drops of clear liquid into it. The black poison immediately turned colorful. Ling Li didn't quite understand it. Every profession had its own specialization. Although his cultivation was far higher than Su Li's, he was no match for Su Li when it came to poisoning and detoxification. Even the two inborn elders of the blood refining hall were easily killed by Su Li. Su Li lowered her eyes and stared at the toxins that constantly contaminated the serum. Various powders were constantly added, and the colors changed constantly. Sometimes it was as ferocious as a skeleton, and sometimes it bloomed like a bloody flower. Ling Li soon found that the colors in the glass bottle changed from black, colorful, red, light yellow, and then became lighter and lighter until it was almost colorless. The poison was almost cured. Suddenly, a black mist rose from the bottom of the bottle and directly dyed all the serum black. The whole bottle of serum boiled with a gurgling sound and burned into nothingness in the blink of an eye. Su Li snorted coldly. She gathered all the smoke and passed it into the fallen fluid. The toxins immediately quieted down as if they had lost all their vitality. Needless to say, Ling Li also knew that Su Li failed. He moved his lips and was about to comfort her. But Su Li had turned around and said indifferently, "The blood poison of the blood refining hall is quite capable. It actually uses the bloody yang flower to refine the yang poison. Then, it is supplemented by 49 kinds of poisonous flowers and grasses, producing 147 kinds of changes. I still need to test the poison many times before I can grasp it accurately." Ling Li's words of comfort were stuck in his throat. He didn't say anything for a long time. Su Li's tone was obviously extremely confident. She didn't seem to be frustrated at all, and it only took her less than an hour to figure out the details of the blood poison. He found that he still underestimated Su Li's means of poison. "You live in the valley these days and can't go out. Don't touch my things. Don't practice martial arts at random." Su Li said 3 requirements in a row. It was not so much a request as an order. Ling Li was stunned and couldn't help but ask, "What can I do?" Su Li glanced at Ling Li and said, "Eat and sleep. Hierarch, enjoy this useless time." Seeing that Su Li finished her words and left directly, Ling Li's gentle eyes flashed a trace of helplessness. He didn't know how to provoke her. She was so fierce. Although he didn't know whether Su Li's requirements were true or not, Ling Li still carefully sealed his cultivation. If he really delayed detoxification because of using Xingong at random, it would be bad. The Xingong he practiced since he was in his mother's womb was still of great use. After temporarily solving the problem in the valley, Su Li became a doctor and came to the Baichao Tang to clean up the mess. The Baichao Tang had been cleaned up by the people and staff of the Desu town. Even the door had been replaced. As soon as Su Li appeared, the people watching around the clinic immediately surrounded her with surprise. "Dr. Xue Li is here." "Great, Dr. Xue Li is fine." A group of men and women in coarse clothes, old and young, were chattering. Suli smiled and stretched out her hand to press gently. Everyone immediately shut up. In their minds, Suli was a living bodhisattva like Qi Xianqing. Of course, they should listen to bodhisattva's words. Last night, the Bai Chao Tang was robbed and I was frightened a lot. Fortunately, it's not a big deal. I come a little late today. Let's start to see patience now. Suli knew that it was easy to reveal flaws if she said too much. She just mentioned it roughly and started to see patients today. Everyone immediately became obedient and queued up spontaneously. Suli also began a new day of medical experience. Although the people in the town only had some minor diseases and chronic diseases, Suli could feel that she had a deeper foundation in the Ghost Valley meditation direction every time she felt their pulse. The Ghost Valley meditation direction is really the treasure of Medical Circle. With the accumulation of many days, she could feel that she was getting closer and closer to the inborn realm. And there was a hint of premonition. It seemed that there was a force that wanted to break the bondage and burst out. Will there be other changes in the Ghost Valley meditation direction after I reach the inborn realm? Suli thought deeply. Qi Xianqing could never think that her practice progress was so exaggerated. So he didn't mention what kind of world it would be after she reached the inborn realm. Suli went back and forth between the valley and the Desu town day after day. Half a month had passed, and Suli didn't return to the Su house once. Lingli had detoxified half of the poison. The other half changed in the process of detoxification, so Suli needed to test the poison again. When Lingli heard the news, his face was extremely pale. Seeing that, Chu Qingning laughed wildly in secret. It was because Suli's detoxification method was too horrible. Lingli had to swallow dozens of poisons and couldn't eat anything else during the period. The taste of the poisons couldn't be better. Lingli retched more than a dozen times a day. His stomach became a battlefield for various poisons to fight. His internal organs were all burned. The torture in the hell was just like this. Fang Yuan secretly vowed that he would never be poisoned in the future. Otherwise, he would be half dead because of Su Li's torture. Didn't he see that Lingli, a young master, was already pale? On the second floor of the bamboo building, Lingli saw Su Li disappear at the entrance of the valley. Then he put down the bamboo window and turned back to lie down. Since he came here, Su Li had never lived in the bamboo building. No matter how late it was, she returned to the Byway building. It seemed that she didn't want to stay in the same place with him for too long. Looking at the low roof of the bamboo building, Lingli was lost in thought. Su Li, was she really detoxifying him? His current skin color was several times darker than before, and he felt that his body was very heavy. The status of the blood refining hall was lower than that of the Shuelo cult. The Inma cult couldn't compare with it. Such a small sect was not famous for refining poisons in the martial arts circle. How could the so-called unique blood poison be so difficult to deal with? The seeds of suspicion gradually germinated. Lingli was more inclined to believe that Su Li was carrying out a secret method while curing the poison for him. Su Li, are you an enemy or a friend? If you really want to poison me, why did you save me at the beginning? Lingli closed his eyes with a heavy heart. He had lived 2 lives and thought that he could understand human nature. But he didn't expect that there would be a woman like Su Li who made him confused. Su Li left the valley and came to the Baichao Tang in the wind and frost of late autumn. Qi Xianqing still left for nearly 2 months. The people in the Desu town had long been accustomed to the existence of the new doctor. As the night went on, there were fewer patients. After the manservant of the Baichao Tang left, Su Li had to see patients and fill the prescription at the same time. The efficiency was reduced by half. At this time, another person stepped in the door. His footsteps were steady but a little weak. Su Li said without raising her head, "Newcomer, please sit at the door and wait for me to finish seeing the patients in front." Then there was no answer for a long time. Su Li noticed that something was wrong. She looked up and saw the face of the person. Her pupils couldn't help but shrink slightly. In front of the bench at the door, a cold-faced teenager covered with blood stood still. His chest rose and fell slightly. He exhaled white gas from his nose from time to time. His right hand drooped. Drops of blood fell to the ground and made a patter sound. The rest of the people saw such a terrible injury of the teenager. They all kept silent and didn't dare to speak. Some people even secretly observed the escape route. Even if Suli lived like a bodhisattva, human nature was always selfish. At this time, everyone wanted to escape and no one thought about Suli's life or death. Suli breathed slightly and said in a deep voice, "The injury on your right shoulder is not light. Fortunately, you won't die for a while. Sit there for a while and wait for me to see the rest of the patients." The corner of the cold teenager's mouth twitched with a trace of astonishment. It seemed that he didn't expect that Suli could say this calmly in front of him. He looked around and hesitated for a moment. Then he sat straight on the bench. The rest of the people were relieved. It turns out that he also comes to see a doctor. The boy really scared me when he just came in. He is injured all over. I am afraid that he was bitten by a beast. Fortunately, he can escape from death. There are so many naughty kids now. I don't know which kid is so arrogant. Tut tut, the patients whispered in a very low voice. They thought that they would not be heard by others. But they didn't know that all the words were clearly heard by Suli and the cold teenager. Chapter 59. After a while, the last patient left happily with the medicine bag. Suli waved to the cold boy and said, "Come here. I will help you apply the medicine." Ling Mo's eyes flashed coldly. He walked over and sat opposite to Suli. But he didn't take the initiative to lift the clothes on his shoulders. Instead, he asked, "Did you save a boy who was almost the same age as me half a month ago?" Suli stopped grinding the medicine and looked up at Ling Mo for a moment. She suddenly smiled and said, "What's the relationship between you and the boy? What will happen if I save him? And what will happen if I don't?" Ling Mo's pupils contracted and he shouted coldly, "Take me to him. If my relationship with him is exposed, it will only bring you a fatal disaster. You are just a doctor. Don't ask what you shouldn't ask." Suli's smile slowly disappeared. She showed a colder look than Ling Mo. "A fatal disaster? I remember that you have long wanted to kill me. If I kill your bamboo, it is just a matter of course. Why can't he pay for it with his life?" Then Suli's face slowly changed and returned to its original appearance. Ling Mo's expression changed dramatically. He instantly retreated and his face was full of killing intent. "Did you kill the master?" Suli slowly picked her nails and smiled. When he came over, he was covered with blood. There were countless saber and sword wounds all over his body. His legs were broken, and there was a strange poison circulating in his body. He was on his last breath. "Even if I didn't kill him, he would die. Why are you angry with me?" "I will kill you." Ling Mo's eyes turned red instantly. The sword on his waist was unsheathed with a clang. A flash of sword light crossed the air and pierced Suli's face. At the same time, blood gushed out from Ling Mo's shoulder. The dried blood on his chest was instantly wet. Suli smiled and tilted her head slightly. She easily avoided the sword. In Ling Mo's shocked eyes, she gently tapped the tip of the sword with her index finger. Clang! There was a continuous buzzing in the air. A powerful force was transmitted from the tip of the sword. Ling Mo's wrist trembled violently, and the wound on his shoulder became deeper. He finally couldn't hold the long sword anymore. It fell to the ground with a whine. Ling Mo was angry and anxious. The enemy who killed his brother was in front of him, but he was not his opponent. If he was at his peak, how could he be beaten down by a person in the acquired 9th hurdle? Suddenly, Ling Mo raised his head and spat out a mouthful of black blood. He fell to the ground. Seeing Suli approaching slowly, his indomitable, tenacious consciousness could not hold on any longer, and he fell into darkness in an instant. Suli picked up Ling Mo with one hand and threw him by the door. Then she shook her head and cleaned the ground. Since she saved Lingli, trouble came one after another. The bastard was poisoned, but he still took a breath to fight. He really didn't want to live. Fine, for his sake, I'll save this kid's life. After cleaning up, Suli picked up the long sword and ran all the way with Ling Mo. She didn't help Ling Mo until she came out of the valley. Hearing the noise, Fang Yuan and Chu Qingning walked out with vigilance. Suli would not come to the valley at this time. When they arrived at the entrance of the valley, they were dumbfounded to see that Suli brought back another teenager. Where did Suli bring back a seriously injured person? Did he send himself to the door like Lingli? When they came to the bamboo building, Lingli, who sealed his cultivation, heard the noise. He opened the door and saw the teenager brought by Suli. His face changed dramatically. Lingimo. Lingli walked quickly to Lingimo and asked nervously, "Where did you find him? How is his injury?" Looking at the large blood stain on Lingmo's chest, the piercing wound on his shoulder, and the crisscross scars on his body, Ling Li's knuckles turned white, and his calm expression was a little flustered. Seeing Ling Li's expression, Suli felt a little uncomfortable and snorted, "He won't die. Fang Yuan, move him to the yard." Fang Yuan nodded and was about to move, but Ling Li shook his head and said, "Let him live with me. I said he lives in the yard. So he lives in the yard." Suli suddenly raised her voice and said coldly, "Ling Li, don't forget that I am the owner of this valley." Ling Li squinted his eyes and immediately stood up to confront Suli. "Then I will live in the yard with him, and you can have the bamboo building back?" Suli laughed out of anger and said lightly, "Go ahead. I won't stop you. I will cure the poison in your body." Ling Li's face was completely gloomy. "Forget it. I will take him away." Then, Ling Li was about to carry Lingimo on his back and turned to walk out of the valley. Suli said calmly, "I have nothing to say if you don't cherish your own life. But Lingimo is also poisoned. If you walk out of here, he will become a dead body within one day. Don't blame me for not reminding you." Hearing this, Ling Li's movement was completely stiff, and the atmosphere was stagnant for a moment. An inexplicable and horrible pneuma slowly emanated from Ling Li. Fang Yuan and Chu Qingning groaned at the same time, and their eyes were full of horror. This was the momentum that only inborn seniors could master. Ling Li was really an inborn senior and a young master. Su Li's face was pale, and she clenched her teeth. There was a layer of tears in her eyes. It turned out that in his heart, she was not as good as Lingimo. "If you use your cultivation, I will not care about you anymore." A stubborn voice with a trace of crying sounded. Ling Li was stunned and looked back. When he saw the tears in the girl's eyes, he loosened his hands and smiled bitterly. What on earth was he fighting for with this girl? Finally, Fang Yuan successfully placed Lingimo in the yard. Suli came to treat him with medicine, but she hit him very hard. Even if Lingimo was in a coma, he couldn't help but moan in pain. Fang Yuan, who was helping, was shocked. Since Ling Li came, Suli's temper was really more and more difficult to guess. At this moment, outside the house, Ling Li sat together with Chu Qingning and others. There was a trace of worry in his eyes from time to time. Although Lingimo was an attendant he picked up when he was a child, he was also the head of the Shuelo cult, who was cultivated by him. Ling Li regarded him as a brother. If something happened to Lingimo, how could he go back and explain to other brothers? "Don't worry." Chu Qingning comforted him. "Suli's medical skills are very good. She can even cure you, not to mention the boy." Ling Li didn't say anything and nodded slightly. But in his mind, the bloody hole in Ling Mo's right shoulder appeared from time to time. That was the trace left by the long spear. Haydn and others were also outside and whispered from time to time, "Miss Suli is so strange today. She is inexplicably angry. In my opinion, Sister Suli is obviously jealous." "What? Who are you jealous of?" A group of melon kids instantly became excited and looked at Haydn, who had just spoken. Haydn smiled wretchedly and whispered, "Who else can it be? It must be Bossling. Didn't you see that Bossling was nervous when he saw the new boy today? Sister Suli must be jealous. Then she will be angry, won't she?" "Wow, it seems to make sense after listening to what you said." Chu Qingning and Ling Li's ears were so sharp that they heard these whispers clearly. Chu Qingning's face immediately became as black as the bottom of a pot. He turned back and scolded, "Bastard! How can you say this? Get out of here. Don't gossip here." Haydn opened his eyes wide. He didn't expect that all his words were heard. He immediately took a group of subordinates out of the yard in fear. "Hey, those guys are talking nonsense. Don't take it to heart." Chu Qingning turned back and smiled. Ling Li was cold all day long. It was impossible for Suli to fall in love with him. Ling Li nodded calmly, but his heart was in turmoil. He recalled the inexplicable quarrel just now. The image of Su Li's tears in her eyes became clearer. From the first time they met, the girl showed extremely abnormal emotions. Did she really know him? Was she really? Shui? Squeak. At this time, the sound of opening the door interrupted Ling Li's thoughts. Su Li walked out with a cold face. She glanced at Ling Li, who wanted to say something but stopped on second thought. Then she turned away without saying anything. The atmosphere was really stiff. Fang Yuan shook his head and sighed. He said for Su Li, "The poison in the body of the one in the room has been cleared by Su Li. The tendons and vessels on the shoulders have been reconnected, but he was seriously injured. I'm afraid that he needs to rest for 3 or 4 days to recover completely by his own cultivation." Ling Li breathed a sigh of relief and obediently returned to the bamboo building. However, he saw that Su Li, who looked tired, was testing the poison for him again. Ling Li was stunned. He hesitated for a while and finally walked behind Su Li. He said softly, "I'm sorry. He is a very important brother to me. Thank you." Su Li stopped. When she heard the words of the man who had always been arrogant behind her, her anger disappeared. She pretended to snort coldly, but she couldn't help smiling. Ling Li stood behind her and couldn't see her. When he heard the snort, he scratched his head. He had never been alone with a girl in his previous life and this life. How could he know that Su Li was in a good mood at the moment? After testing a poison, it was already late at night. Ling Li didn't fall asleep. He got up and saw Su Li stop. He couldn't help but suggest, "It's too late to go back today. Why don't you stay here for the night?" Su Li's movement was stiff. She didn't look at Ling Li. She turned around and opened the bamboo door to leave. Ling Li was more and more confused. Then he was suddenly shocked. Did Su Li misunderstand something? He just asked her to stay in the yard. The boundless darkness lasted for a long time. Ling Mo struggled to open his eyes, but his eyes were blurred. Could it be that this place was hell? He still remembered the scene when he was in a coma in front of Su Li. His vision was blurred for a moment and suddenly became clear. Ling Mo finally saw clearly that it was the roof. "I'm not dead yet?" Ling Mo was stunned. It shouldn't be. He had already become a fish on the chopping board. Su Li had no reason not to kill him. Suddenly, he felt shadows moving. After forcing himself to turn his gaze, he immediately saw a row of young boys blinking their eyes. These young boys looked to be no more than 8 or 9 years old. Their clothes were not expensive, but they were very clean and tidy. "Is he awake?" Haydn pointed to Ling Mo's face and asked. The silly boys behind him immediately nodded. Haydn immediately gave a little boy a knock on the head. "What are you waiting for? Go and call the bosses." A group of silly boys immediately left. Bosses? Ling Mo was full of doubts. Was it possible that he was saved by the leader of an organization? After a while, a figure rushed into the room like a phantom. When Ling Mo saw the person clearly, he immediately widened his eyes and shouted unbelievably, "Master?" Ling Li saw that Ling Mo could speak, so he immediately breathed a sigh of relief. He smiled and said, "Don't worry. You are lucky and have a good life. Everything is fine now." But yesterday, before Ling Mo finished his words, Haydn interrupted, "It was Sister Su Li who carried you back. You were about to die at that time. Sister Su Li saved you. And Boss Ling, if it weren't for Sister Su Li, he would have been dead. You brat, I haven't beaten you for 1 day. How dare you? You dare to say anything?" As soon as Chu Qingning came in, he heard Haydn's clamor. He immediately chased after Haydn and beat him violently. Ling Mo was completely confused in the continuous screams. What the hell was going on? After the farce, others left, leaving Ling Li and Haydn to talk. Ling Mo immediately told them what happened last night. Ling Li was silent again. After a while, he said, "Zhao Ming is from the blood refining hall." Chapter 60. Su Li tried to test you last night. Ling Li's tone was calm, but his heart was in turmoil. He said, "If you hadn't been provoked last night, she might not have saved you or brought you here." Ling Mo listened blankly and couldn't help blurting out, "Master, is Su Li your mistress outside?" Ling Li's face trembled when he heard the words. He said sharply, How is it possible? Don't say that again. Oh. Ling Imo nodded obediently, but he felt that the master was trying to cover something up. He remembered that there was a peerless enchantress in the Enma cult. He couldn't help but twitch his mouth. He really didn't know the master. Unfortunately, Su Li's appearance was not as good as that one. According to the boy's temperament of pursuing perfection, he should choose her. By the way, where did you find this place? Ling Imo immediately became serious when Ling Li asked about the business. He said in a low voice, Master, after you went to the banquet that day, I took people to the border and killed the enemy general before second brother Ling met the enemy. The whole journey was extremely smooth. When I dismissed my men and went to the border branch to find you, I was ambushed. When I got rid of the pursuers, I came to find you. Then I heard that the medical house in the Desu town was robbed, so I came to investigate. Ling Li heard the words and was lost in thought. Ling Imo kept quiet consciously. After a while, Ling Li raised his head, and there seemed to be a flash of red in his eyes. After you recover, take people of the Shuelo cult to the branch in the Qinghe province. If there is no traitor, hide. If there is, kill them and block the news. Then come back and clean the border branch. Ling Li's words were full of human lives. At this moment, Ling Li finally showed the demeanor of the hierarch of the Enma cult. Ling Imo nodded without hesitation. He was a killing sword in the hands of the master. Then, Ling Li's tone suddenly became light and seemed to be a little gentle. Go to the Desu town and check the Su house. I heard that Su Li was driven out of the house. You go and have a look. Ling Imo couldn't help but smile strangely when he heard the words. The master really said one thing and meant another. 3 days later, Ling Imo really left the valley. Su Li didn't care about his whereabouts at all, because Fang Yuan told her that the glutinous rice that was fermented a few days ago had been made into wine. Su Li came in a hurry and went into the warehouse without looking at Ling Li. She moved jars of polished glutinous rice out. Ling Li felt strange and came over to have a look. He was immediately caught by Su Li. Ling Li opened the jar and smelled the fragrance of the wine. He was shocked and asked, Are you making wine? Su Li glanced at him meaningfully, but said, Isn't it obvious? Is it possible that Hierarch Ling was injured and hurt his brain? Ling Li was used to Su Li's disagreeable temperament. He shut up sensibly and didn't ask again. However, the throbbing in his heart became more and more obvious. The taste of this wine was made in his previous life. The brewery of Dahan country didn't brew wine like this. Su Li definitely had something to do with the world before he crossed over. Su Li didn't pay attention to Ling Li, who was in a daze. She put the fine gauze on the mouth alone, poured the fermented wine into the gauze, and poured cold water on the wine. The water drops fell. Her eyes gradually became dazed, and pictures flashed in front of her. The man sat on the wooden chair and guided her to move the gauze, pour the wine, and make the best wine with various tastes. Su Li, are you okay? Su Li suddenly woke up. She saw the face of the man in front of her. He was less gentle and more calm and indifferent. I'm fine. Su Li took a deep breath and began to rub the rice with her hands until the wine was rubbed down. The remaining rice dregs were poured away. Then she began to filter the wine. After all the jars were filtered, there was a whole jar of thick wine left. Ling Li consciously carried the jar to the kitchen and poured the thick wine into the pot. Su Li looked at this scene in a daze. There was an impulse in her heart. She wanted to tell him everything and live with him in the valley for a lifetime. But she knew that everything was wishful thinking. When she cured Ling Li's injury, they would not meet each other on the surface. She would only help him secretly and help him become an emperor. She wouldn't see him again in this life. Her way back should be to go back to hell. Why should she take him with her? Boil it and then put it into the porcelain bucket. Su Li's tone was a little trembling. She took a deep breath again and calmed down. She said, I have dried osmanthus and sugar in my bamboo house. You should know what to do. Then she left the valley regardless of Ling Li's dull face. It's really you, Shui. Ling Li looked at the thick wine in the pot and stood still. He wanted to catch up with her and ask why she killed him in the previous life. But in the end, he still failed to summon up the courage. Su Li didn't go back to the valley for a few days. She had tested the new poison, and the rest of the medicine bags were put on the table according to the day. As long as Lingley was not stupid, he would naturally take it on time. On this day, Suli came to the Byway building, but she didn't see the humble figure of shopkeeper Wu as usual. Miss, shopkeeper Wu caught a cold and was bedridden. I was worried that it was not appropriate for me to send the account book to him. He sure came over and told the reason. He touched his head and smiled embarrassedly. Now there were many more chefs in the Byway building, but he sure still had the highest status among them. This was not only because he sure was the first to rely on the Byway building, but also because in the operation of the Byway building for half a year, he sure learned from Suli's cooking skills and made rapid progress in cooking. He could already make the precious beggar's chicken by himself, but he sure consciously only told Suli this secret, and he didn't tell the Su house. He also faintly perceived the attitude of the Su family towards Suli. He regarded Suli as a little master, so he was naturally indignant and stood on Suli's side. Then I will send it to him in person. Speaking of which, I haven't gone back for a long time. I don't know how my father is doing. Suli sighed. He sure couldn't help but feel sad. Suli was such an outstanding woman, but she was born in a ruthless family. Unfortunately, he had no ability to help Suli change her fate, so he could only sigh helplessly. Suli sat in the carriage, and her heart was calm. The carriage stopped in front of the Su house. Suli's expression had returned to her usual tenderness. She hesitated for a moment, and then stepped into the Su house. But before she could step into the Su house, she was stopped by two strange guards. The head of the family ordered that no one is allowed to enter recently. Suli seemed to be frightened. Her face was slightly pale, and she retorted without confidence, "Who are you?" "I am the second miss of the Su family. Why haven't I seen you before?" The guard standing on the right sneered and said proudly, "Second miss, I naturally recognize your appearance. We are the guards newly recruited by old Madame Su. Second miss, please go back. Old Madame ordered that you, especially you, must not enter the Su house during this time." Suli's body trembled slightly, and she stepped back a few steps absent-mindedly. Even the account book in her hand fell to the ground. The guard saw the account book on the ground and immediately picked it up and said, "It turns out that you are here to deliver the account book. I will take you to deliver it. Miss, please go back." Suli's eyes were watery, and a drop of tear fell to the ground and splashed the dust. The guard on the left couldn't bear it and wanted to get out of the way. But he was warned by the guard on the right with a fierce look and whispered, "Don't forget how Xiaojiao and other boys were driven out of the Su family." The guard on the left was stiff and immediately stopped. He looked up and only saw Suli climb into the carriage and leave. After entering the carriage, Suli wiped away her tears, and her expression quickly returned to indifference. Fang Yuan, who was driving the carriage, heard that the breath inside quickly calmed down. He immediately curled his lips and couldn't help but ask, "What's the point of doing this? With your achievements in the poison circle, isn't it a piece of cake to deal with the Su family?" Suli chuckled and said, "That's boring. If that's all I want, why come back again?" Fang Yuan lowered his eyes and was puzzled. Come back again? What did that mean? They had promised each other not to explore each other's background. But now Fang Yuan wanted to know the past of the girl behind him and then help her vent her anger. There were two ends of a flower, and each was a branch. At this moment, in the Jinyuan court, Zhu Yin and Su Zipei immediately knew that Suli left. Su Zipei heard that Suli left with tears and couldn't help but laugh. "Ha ha ha, mother. It's really a relief. I remember that when Suli was driven away that day, she didn't shed a tear. I thought she really didn't care about it at all." Zhu Yin touched her belly and took a long breath. She smiled and said, "It's just a small advantage. Zipei, you should have a long-term vision. If you wait until we drive her out of the Su family, it won't be too late to be happy." "I know, mother." Su Zipei rolled her eyes and whispered beside Zhu Yin, "Mother, do you have any good ideas?" "Well, you go to find Witch Tang again and so on." Su Zipei's eyes lit up and she said excitedly, "Great. Grandma heard what Witch Tang said. She will definitely pester father to marry Suli. In this way, Suli can stay in the Desu town and won't be afraid that she will make trouble in Yunjing." "Mother, you are so great." Zhu Yin heard her daughter's praise and felt happy. She reached out and touched Suzy Pei's nose. She said angrily, "Go quickly. Don't let others find you." "I know." Suzy Pei changed into an inconspicuous outfit and sneaked out from the back door of Jean Garden. However, she did not notice that the moment she left the Su family, a black shadow immediately followed behind her. Suzy Pei thought to herself, "That's right." An hour later, Suzy Pei returned to the Jinyuan court with a proud face. She thought that no one knew her and confidently went to her mother to ask for credit. Ling Yimo, who was in the dark, snorted and turned away. In the valley, Ling Li was holding a pot of osmanthus wine and lying on the rattan chair. He squinted his eyes leisurely. At this moment, a breeze blew. Ling Li still didn't open his eyes and said, "You are back. How is it going?" Ling Yimo stood still and glanced at the wine pot in Ling Li's hand. He shook his head and chuckled. He didn't expect that the master still had the leisure to brew wine. It seemed that the blood poison in his body was no longer a problem. "Master, Xiaoming really hid in the distribution of the Qinghe province. A few traders in the Qinghe province have been killed. In addition, the distribution of the border has been cleaned up. The new branch candidates are waiting for you to decide." Ling Li immediately sat up and opened his eyes. His eyes were rarely serious. He said, "How is the investigation of Su Li going?" Ling Yimo thought of what he saw during the day and silently thought for a while. He wanted to find a wording that wouldn't make the master angry, but he couldn't find it at all. He sighed and said, "The situation of Miss Su Li doesn't seem to be so." "What?" Ling Yimo sat straighter, but he didn't notice it. He said, "Tell me in detail. Don't miss any detail." Ling Yimo felt more strange and finally told what he saw and heard. Hearing the suffering of Su Li from childhood to adulthood, Ling Yimo couldn't help but bite his lips and breathe slightly. The scene of seeing Su Li for the first time reappeared in his mind. It turned out that she was far less beautiful than she looked. In contrast, how happy he was in this life. I also heard that the first madam of the Su house, that is, the biological mother of Miss Su Li, bribed the witch to fabricate a story that would harm her brother's life. The old woman of the Su house believed it and drove Miss Su Li out of the Su family. Zhu Yin was not dissatisfied. Today, she bribed the witch to come up with a more exaggerated story. Chapter 61. Nonsense. After hearing the witch's words, Su Huanli was furious. He pounded the table and stood up. "Witch Zhao, what are you talking about? If my daughter is really so tough, she would have killed my family long ago. It's not your turn to say that." In the central room, the witch in colorful clothes shrank her neck and said in a low voice, "Master, you're wrong. Miss Su is really the bane of her younger brother's life. She looks like a fox, and the atmosphere in the heavens is extremely gloomy. She will inevitably bring a fatal disaster to her younger brother. At the critical moment, we can only marry Miss Su. The worse the marriage is, the better the life of the child in the belly of the first madam will be. It is even possible that the child will be promoted and be better than the first master in the future," which was an expert at playing tricks. Her words, coupled with her sinister tone, sent chills down everyone's spines. Zhu Yin was afraid, but she praised in her heart. Witch Zhao was really capable. Even Su Huanli, who never believed in these things, was stunned. "Ma'am." Su Chui was unhappy when she heard her son's words. She pounded the table and scolded, "Huanli, how can you say that? You should have a limit to protect area. Now your son is still in the belly of Zhu Yin, but you protect the bane of your younger brother's life. Is it reasonable? I tell you, today I will find a husband for area. Don't make me angry." "After ma'am." Su Chui scolded Su Huanli. She left with the help of Su Zipei, regardless of Su Huanli's angry face. "Ma'am." Su Chui left. Witch Zhao would not stay here to make trouble for herself. She said goodbye and turned away. At this time, Li Yin, who stood aside silently, came forward and reminded in a low voice, "Master, although the Dahan country is not against superstition, if they know that our Su family did such a ridiculous thing just because of the witch's words, I am afraid that the first master will be ridiculed." What kind of magic potion did Zhu Yin give my mother? If she were not pregnant, I would have divorced her long ago. Su Huanli waved his sleeves and said, You don't have to worry about it. Even if my mother finds a husband for Li, I will not agree. Li Yin frowned. The master's attitude seemed to be very firm. After all, the second miss was the main source of income of the Su family. But he thought it was just polite words. Shouldn't they send someone to protect the second miss? What if the old woman makes trouble? Li Yin shook his head and left. Forget it. It was better to send Little Nine and the others to secretly protect second Mississippi. Little Nine and the others were not considered people of the Su family, so they did not go against the old master's orders. After Li Yin retreated, Su Huanli restrained his anger and was full of helplessness. How could he not know that it was Zhu Yin who made trouble for him this time? He didn't want to marry Su Li or let Su Li marry into the Su family. After all, Su Li was more beautiful than Zipei. If she went to Yunjing, she would definitely get a rich husband and stabilize the position of the Su family. On one hand, it was his mother. On the other hand, it was the interests of the Su family. Su Huanli was in a dilemma. He only hoped that it could be delayed until Su Qingtan came back to solve the matter. At this moment, Zhu Yin had spread the news that the Su family was looking for a son-in-law, but she didn't say which daughter it was. The standard of choosing a son-in-law was even more shocking. What do you mean the worse the family situation is, the worse the character, the better? There is no age limit. Is it possible to find a husband for Su Zipei? After all, the Su family is the richest family in the Desu town. The conditions are too loose. The punks in the South Street alley were excited when they saw the notice. Letters of self-recommendation floated into the Su house like snowflakes. These movements naturally attracted Su Li's attention. What the hell are Zhu Yin and Ma'am Su Chui doing? Fang Yuan looked worried and said in a stern voice, Are they choosing a son-in-law for you? They are so vicious. Su Li smiled lightly and said in a calm tone, Mother really has a lot of wicked ideas, but it is easy to solve this matter. I am afraid that you and Chu Qingning have to work hard. Fang Yuan felt strange. He had never seen such a bad relationship between the mother and the daughter. They were completely on the opposite side. Dr. Zhu repeatedly tried to put Su Li in a difficult situation. At the same time, in the Jinyuan court, Su Zipei took the paper and read it one by one. It seemed that she was very excited. She came to Ma'am Su Chui from time to time and said, Grandma, this is also good. 3 generations of his ancestors were poor. This generation is so poor that they can't even eat. He is a real beggar. He is 40 years old. Ma'am Su Chui shook her head and said, Although he is qualified, his temper is not bad enough. He is not suitable. At this time, Zhu Yin came happily and said, Mother, there is a candidate. He is from the Zhu family in the South Street alley. All the fathers of this family are gamblers, and they have the habit of beating their wives. All the women who married into this family were seriously injured and finally died of illness. I have inquired about it. There is a little son in this family who is just over 30 years old. No one dares to marry his daughter. Now he is still single. Su Zipei clapped her hands and said happily, Grandma, this is the most suitable one. His family must be very poor. He has a bad temper and likes to beat his wife. If second sister marries him, she must be miserable. In this way, the life of the younger brother in mother's belly will be very good. Ma'am Su Chui's eyes were also shining. She nodded and said, I will send someone to talk with that family. Let them come to propose marriage tomorrow. It happens that Huanli will go out tomorrow. I will make the decision on behalf of him and directly agree. Hearing Ma'am Su Chui's words, Zhu Yin and Su Zipei looked at each other and saw the joy in each other's eyes. This time's efforts were finally not in vain. In a smelly yard in the South Street alley, the mammy of the Su house pinched her nose and walked in to inform them. Then she immediately left the yard as if she was running for her life. This smell was really suffocating. Ha 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 ha. The Su family really didn't lie. I also have a wife. The yellow-skinned man with a beard jumped up and rubbed the mud on his body. He showed the signature smile of a gambler and said, I heard that the Su family has a dowry. When I marry the daughter of the Su family tomorrow, I will be very lucky. Then I will gamble again. Hey, hey, silly son. The casino gave you the name of Gambler Zhu. Do you really think that you are the god of gamblers? Zhu Yan's father staggered out with a drunken hiccup. He smiled obscenely and said, "If you don't take good care of your wife, I will make you a cuckold." Dad, what is mine is yours. The daughter of the Su family is married to the Zhu family. She is a member of the Zhu family. As the saying goes, if you marry a chicken, follow the chicken. If you marry a dog, follow the dog. We enjoy it together. What can the Su family say? Then Gambler Zhu laughed and was about to go out with a piece of silver that he had just robbed from the mammy of the Su family. Suddenly, a black shadow flashed in front of him. Ah! With the screams of an old man and a young man, the blood stained the courtyard wall, which was very enchanting. The next morning, Zhu Yin got up to dress up and waited for the Gambler Zhu's family to propose marriage. Ma'am, Su Chui also waited with a smile on her face. Even the dowry was properly prepared. When the sun was high up in the sky, no one came. Zhu Yin and Ma'am Su Chui were not very good. They had already inquired about how bad the Gambler Zhu's family was. They did not expect that they could be late for the proposal. Old lady, something bad happened. The mammy who sent the news yesterday ran in a panic. She knelt on the ground and said hurriedly, "The Gambler Zhu's family was cut into pieces in their own courtyard yesterday. I heard that the Gambler Zhu owed too much debt and was killed by the debt collectors." Hearing this, Zhu Yin and Ma'am Su Chui were stunned and couldn't believe what they heard. Zhu Yan's face was gloomy. How could it be so coincidental? They just went to inform the Zhu family yesterday. Today, the Zhu family was killed. Damn it. If they had informed the Zhu family one day earlier, maybe Su Li would have been married and killed by the debt collectors. She didn't need to worry about it. The Gambler Zhu's family was a rascal and was killed by the debt collectors. Although the news came abruptly, Ma'am Su Chui and Zhu Yin didn't feel strange. This kind of thing happened on the South Street. Since the most suitable candidate has been killed, although Ma'am Su Chui was angry, she was still calm and said, "Yin, go to bring the second-class family. I will have a look and decide the next candidate." Okay. Zhu Yin immediately returned to the room. There were many self-recommendation letters. It didn't matter if one was missing. In the Byway building, Su Li got the news and heard the familiar footsteps outside the door. She didn't look back and said, "Fang Yuan, thank you this time." Fang Yuan came with a strange look inside. "I would like to accept your gratitude, but when I went there, the Zhu family had all died." What? Su Li's eyes were slightly fixed, but she heard Fang Yuan said again, "The person who killed them was extremely cruel. He cut the father and son of the Zhu family into 8 pieces. The whole yard was dyed red. I don't know what kind of deep hatred they had. However, the 2 people of the Zhu family were really bad. If I killed them, I would probably whip their corpses to vent my anger." Fang Yuan told the deeds of the Zhu family in detail that he had heard. Su Li's eyes were clear, and there seemed to be light flowing in them. "Are you the one helping me in the dark?" She wanted to ask him, but she didn't dare. Outside the valley, Ling Yimo came with a cold face. He was surrounded by blood and was full of killing intent. Until he approached the entrance of the valley, Ling Yimo took a deep breath. The blood in his eyes slowly receded, and he changed from the lord of the Shuelo cult to a cold teenager. "Master, I'm back." Ling Li was eating the poison with difficulty. When he heard Ling Mo's voice, he immediately swallowed the rest of the poison. After flirting for a moment, he went downstairs and asked, "How is it?" Ling Yimo frowned and couldn't help saying angrily, "Miss Su's biological mother is too much. She even wants Miss Su to marry a group of gamblers. That family doesn't know what shame is at all. It's simply a fire pit. Young master, I killed their entire family without authorization. Please punish me, young master." Ling Li's original order was to let Ling Yimo warn the beggars and punks in the Desu town not to intervene in the marriage of the Su family. But Ling Yimo was so angry that he directly killed them, which violated Ling Li's taboo. Ling Li was silent for a moment, but suddenly laughed and said, "You did a good job. Killing the chicken to warn the monkey can scare many people away, but it is not enough. Next, you have to do this." Chapter 62. The study of the Jinyuan court was full of self-recommendation letters. After a whole day's selection, Zhu Yin and Ma'am Su Chui were tired. However, they finally chose a suitable candidate. This person's temperament was worse than that of gambler Zhu. The ninth son of the Wang family has been farming for generations. His family has a meager income, but he lives a good life. The ninth son of the Wang family is 45 years old. He married 2 wives, but both of them were abused to death by him. However, few people know this news. They all think that the ninth son of the Wang family is unlucky. It is said in the letter by the ninth son of the Wang family. Ma'am Su Chui and Zhu Yin nodded slightly and sent Mammy to contact the ninth son of the Wang family. Not long after, the old Mammy came back with a strange look and said hesitantly, "Old lady, madam, I went to the ninth son of the Wang family, but the ninth son of the Wang family did not admit that he sent the self-recommendation letter. He said that he was not interested in the Su family at all, and then he drove me out." Zhu Yin and Ma'am Su Chui were shocked again. It was difficult to find a good family for their children. Why was it so difficult to find a ruffian with a bad character? It was so strange. Ma'am Su Chui held her crutch and said, "Su area is really a disaster. I don't believe it. Xiao Yin, send your nanny out as well. Go to all the suitable families." Zhu Yin was happy and understood that Ma'am Su Chui was going to find a bad family for Su area, regardless of the standard. In order to avoid trouble, she immediately sent all the mammies under her command. Such a situation made people in the Desu town laugh secretly. The reputation of the third daughter of the Su family was so bad that even the ninth son of the Wang family was not willing to marry her. It was really ridiculous. Another day passed. Su area quietly watched the development of the situation. She just asked Fang Yuan to inquire about the news and did nothing else. She wanted to see how much that person could do for her. In the morning of the next day, the mammies who had been busy all night returned to the Su house one after another. They all looked very strange. "Old lady, it's strange. When the families that I went to saw me, they all looked at me as if they saw a ghost. They didn't admit that they had submitted the self-recommendation letter and didn't mention the marriage." "Old madam, it's the same here. There were a few houses where I couldn't even enter, and I was even pelted with stones." An old nanny covered her forehead and said angrily, "Old madam, the families I visited are all notorious scoundrels, but all of them had their legs broken. It was a miserable sight. When I mentioned marriage, she was so scared that she chased me out of the door." The more the old madam listened, the uglier her expression became. At the end, she was so angry that she grabbed the teacup beside her and smashed it on the ground. "I see. I was wondering why everything was so coincidental. It turns out that someone is helping that foxy woman." Zhu Yan's expression was also very bad. In the past 2 days, she sent someone to monitor Su Li. After knowing that Su Li didn't go out of the Baiwei building, she was unable to stop her. Who was helping her? Zhu Yin was puzzled. Su Li was tortured by her since childhood, and she had no social circle at all. How could someone get the news at this time and help him secretly? Thinking of this, Su Li's amazing appearance suddenly appeared in Zhu Yan's mind. Could it be that he's a young master of some family? He's admired that lass for a long time and has always been paying attention to her. This time, he even helped her to stop my plan? The more Zhu Yin thought about it, the more likely it was. But Su Li was really too beautiful. In the Desu town, she was like a crane in a flock of chickens. It was difficult for her not to attract attention. There were too many people who admired her beauty. How could she guess who it was? For a moment, the room fell into an extremely awkward silence. Zhu Yin looked at the old mammies kneeling down. She was so angry that it almost rushed into her brain. She had painstakingly planned for so long, but she didn't expect that there would be such an accident. Was Su area really her nemesis? Things have come to this point. Don't mention marriage. "Ma'am." Su Chui smashed a teacup and seemed to calm down. She said, "Yin, don't be angry, so as not to affect the fetus in your belly. I will find a way for you." "Then, ma'am." Su Chui sneered a few times. If he wanted to make that wretched girl live a more miserable life, there were many other ways besides marrying someone. Why should she stick to a dead end? Zhu Yin saw that, ma'am. Su Chui and Su Li were in conflict. She was happy and said, that girl's luck can't be so good all the time. It's a pity that I have to take care of the fetus and can't help you. Ma'am. Su Chui looked at Zhu Yan's slightly bulging belly and immediately became gentle. She said, leave it to me. Huanli doesn't help you, but I will. Ma'am. Su Chui felt guilty when she thought that Zhu Yin couldn't get pregnant, and she had to let Su Huanli marry the second wife to continue the family line. Finally, Zhu Yin was pregnant, but she gave birth to Su Li, who was a loser. It was really annoying. She didn't blame Zhu Yin. Instead, she vented all her resentment on Su Li. It could be said that if Ma'am Su Chui didn't stop Su Huanli from managing the affairs of the West Courtyard, Su Li would not be so miserable when she was a child. Later, Zhu Yin acted again and took the blame for Su Li, which made Ma'am Su Chui's feeling towards Su Li directly rose from disgust to hatred. It could be said that even if Zhu Yin didn't find a witch to talk nonsense, Ma'am Su Chui would try to deal with Su Li. Zhu Yin just gave her a reason. After the farce, everything seemed to be as usual. The whole Desu town began to spread the notoriety that Su Zipei couldn't get married, but Su Zipei was still kept in the dark. She didn't know that she lifted a stone and dropped it on her own feet. The business of the Byway building was as usual. The reputation of the beggar's chicken gradually spread to several other towns. But because the means of transportation of the Su family were limited, and Su Li needed to earn extra money every 2 months, Su Huanli had no money to expand the business. Counting the time, Su Li estimated that Ling Li's poison had almost been detoxified. After finishing the business of the Byway building that day, she came to the valley and smelled the wine. It's the osmanthus wine. Su Li remembered that she ignored an extremely serious problem. She walked quickly to the yard and saw Ling Li holding the wine pot in his hand. There was an empty jar in the corner next to him. The wine had been bottomed out. Su Li's face instantly darkened. A whole jar of osmanthus wine was drunk by Ling Li in only a few days. Chu Qingning came in from behind. When he saw Su Li, who he hadn't seen for a long time, he immediately laughed and said, Su Li, you've finally come. Hiccup. A burp suddenly came from his throat. Chu Qingning hurriedly covered his mouth and turned to run away. It turns out that the wine I made is spoiled in this way. Su Li's tone was very calm, but Ling Li heard the anger in it. He straightened up and waved away the smell of alcohol. He smiled cheekily and said, I made a lot of wine for you, and I also taught those boys how to make wine. This jar of wine is my reward. How about it? Su Li was silent and stared at Ling Li's face, which had almost recovered to fair. An inexplicable atmosphere slowly spread. Ling Li's smile became more and more stiff. Shouldn't this girl be angry? Could it be that she poisoned the wine? Have you taken the medicine today? When Ling Li was thinking, Su Li suddenly broke the silence. Ling Li nodded subconsciously when he heard the words. Before he responded, he was pulled out of the yard. The sudden skin contact made Ling Li's ears red. He was quite angry and said, What are you going to do? I really took the medicine. Su Li didn't speak all the way. Under the shocked gaze of all the minions, they went up to the bamboo building. What on earth are you going to do? Ling Li shook off Su Li's hand. His cultivation was still sealed, so he staggered and fell on the bed, which made his face redder. What was wrong with Su Li today? Su Li glanced at her right hand, which was shaken off, and said lightly, Of course, I know that you take medicine every day. Otherwise, your skin color can't recover to this extent. Today is the last day to cure the poison. I will make the poison you will take today. Then, Su Li ignored Ling Li and turned to concentrate on the pharmacology. Ling Li sat up and looked at Su Li's back. Suddenly, he felt that this scene was very familiar. It seemed that there was such a person a long time ago. She accompanied him every day, took care of him, and cooked for him. Cooked? Bah! Ling Li's face suddenly turned pale. What was in Su Li's hand now was not a dish, but a real poison. Was he infected by Su Li? How could he have such an absurd idea? My previous life was not in this world at all, and there was no such person. Ling Li shook his head and shook off the miscellaneous thoughts. At this moment, Su Li turned around and held a whole bottle of colorful muddy liquid in her hand. Ling Li's face changed immediately. The taste of this liquid must not be good. Drink it. Su Li handed the glass bottle to Ling Li with a cold face. Ling Li glanced at her in different expression and hesitated for a moment. Then he took it and drank it. Gudong, gudong. After drinking it all at once, Ling Li frowned. Bitter. It was extremely bitter. He didn't let the poison stay in his mouth for a long time, but it still completely numbed his taste, leaving only unbearable bitterness. Su Li was expressionless, but her eyes were full of tension. She observed Ling Li's reaction without a blink. After a while, the bitterness in his mouth faded away. Ling Li sat cross-legged on the bed and began to wait for the reaction in his pubic region. Every time he took the poison, his stomach was like a tumbling sea, and there was a sharp pain. The sharp pain seemed that someone was pulling the 5 viscera out from the outside. It was extremely painful. But what kind of person was Ling Li? Although the pain was severe, it was not the limit he could bear. This time, he made up his mind not to make a fool of himself in front of Su Li. However, the situation was obviously different the last time. Ling Li waited for a long time, but he didn't feel anything. When he was about to ask, he suddenly felt that his whole body was like falling into an ice cave, and cold air came out. It's so cold. Is it the cold poison? Ling Li couldn't help curling up together. His eyebrows were instantly covered with a layer of frost, and his lips were frozen purple. There was a thin layer of ice on the surface of his body. What's going on? Ling Li wanted to look up at Su Li's expression, but found that even his eyeballs were frozen and could not move. His viscera seemed to be sunk into the glacier of thousands of years. He felt that his body was slowly stiffening, and it would not take long for him to be frozen to death. Ling Li couldn't breathe when he opened his mouth. He forced a bitter smile and said, "Well, you really want to kill." At this moment, a bloody lip blocked Ling Li's mouth, which immediately made him widen his eyes and show an unprecedented dull expression. He, the dignified killerling and the supreme existence of the Enma cult, was actually kissed by a miss of a small town here. He suddenly looked up and found that Su Li's face was slowly changing, becoming more and more beautiful, more and more dazzling, more and more beautiful. Ling Li was so surprised that he opened his mouth slightly. This is nothing unusual. Ling Li suddenly felt angry. They had known each other for a whole month, but this girl didn't show her true face. At the same time, he was secretly delighted. Could it be that he was the only one who saw this face? No, nothing extraordinary was an extremely precious disguise technique, and her poison technique could not be self-taught. There must be an unfathomable master standing behind him, but no matter how powerful he was, he couldn't possibly be my opponent. Well, why should I compare who is stronger and who is weaker? Did I fall in love with this girl? Ling Li's mind was in a mess, and his state of mind was even worse than that of the acquired senior. Ling Amo stood outside the door like a robot, not daring to peek or let anyone in. The momentum just now. Master must have broken through the inborn 7th hurdle. Master was really a genius to reach the inborn 7th hurdle at the age of 16. After 2 hours, Su Li's eyebrows trembled and she was about to open her eyes. Ling Li saw it and immediately left the room. At the moment when Ling Li left, Su Li opened her eyes, sat up and rubbed her eyebrows which were still in pain. I fainted. Thinking of what happened in the bamboo building before, Su Li immediately got up and got out of bed. She walked to the door and touched her face. Suddenly, she realized something and immediately ran nothing extraordinary again. Then she opened the door and walked out. Hearing the sound of opening the door, Ling Li immediately pretended to turn his head and breathed a sigh of relief. You finally wake up. Su Li saw that there was no abnormality on everyone's face, so she was relieved and asked, "How long did I faint?" "Only 2 hours, and it's still early." Chu Qingning replied and kept looking at Ling Li and Su Li. What happened just now? How could the roof of the bamboo building be lifted? Su Li shook her head and said, "The last step of detoxification was a little noisy." Fortunately, it was successful. Lingli, how do you feel now? Lingli was suddenly called. He was shocked and said, the poison has been detoxified. Sorry to bother you. Such a tone immediately surprised Lingimo, who knew the details of his master. Did the master really fall in love with Suli? Suli nodded slightly and took out a black porcelain bottle from her waist. She poured out a black elixir and said, eat it. Lingli took it and swallowed it without asking. He didn't want to let Suli down again. But after he ate it, he saw Suli with a strange look and asked, don't you ask what it is? Lingli laughed loudly and said, is it poison? I believe you. Suli's expression suddenly became more strange. Lingli's face changed, and he suddenly felt a sharp pain in his heart. It was a symptom of poisoning. Clang! Lingimo unsheathed his long sword and pointed at Suli with a murderous look. Give me the antidote. Chu Qingning immediately looked cold and stood in front of Suli. Lingli covered his chest and frowned. He couldn't figure out why Suli just helped him detoxify and gave him poison again. Suli looked indifferent and put her hands behind her. She looked at Lingli's body, which was bent because of the pain. If she wanted to succeed, she must have the capital. She worked hard for a month and spent 100,000 taels of silver, which was to increase the capital for Lingli. Suddenly, Lingli felt that the pain in his body receded like the tide and returned to the original state in an instant. He didn't seem to be poisoned at all. Lingimo was also stunned and slowly took back his long sword. He couldn't help but twitch his mouth. Miss Suli really liked to play pranks. You lied to me again. Lingli dried his sweat and smiled bitterly. After getting along with her for a month, he completely figured out what the girl wanted to do. Every time he thought he had understood Suli's purpose, he was slapped in the face at the speed of light. It was the first time in his life that he couldn't control the feeling. I didn't lie to you. Suli slowly put away the black porcelain bottle and said, what I gave you was indeed extremely poisonous, more poisonous than the blood poison. It was your body that decomposed the poison by itself. It had nothing to do with me. Lingli was stunned and didn't say anything. After a long time, he said with doubt, the body of immunity to all poisons? It's not that exaggerated. Suli didn't seem to be proud at all. She said, at most, it can detoxify 90% of the poisons in the world. If you're poisoned, you still have to come to me in person. It turns out that you have been letting me take poison for this reason. Lingli's eyes became more and more complicated. He guessed wrong again. It turned out that helping him to improve his cultivation was just incidental. The real purpose was this magical physique. The body of immunity to all poisons was the physique that all warriors in the martial arts circle dreamed of. If they could have it, their survival ability would be greatly improved. Lingli had also looked for the secret prescription of the body of immunity to all poisons, but he couldn't find it. He didn't expect that it would be realized by Suli. Don't look at me like that. I just don't want to see that the person I saved is poisoned to death one day. Suli smiled and said, it's a great insult to me. Lingli touched his chest. He got so many benefits from Suli in this month that he didn't know how to thank her. Was it because of what she had done in the previous life that she did this to compensate him? Lingli was struggling. He was silent for a long time and didn't ask. Instead, he took out a cyan jade token with a warm texture from his arms and put it in Suli's hand. Suli turned around, and her expression was unclear. But Lingli could feel the inexplicable firmness of the girl. I'm afraid that you will be angry if I ask. Lingli shrugged and said half-jokingly, what if you are angry and poison me again? I have no money. Suli stared at Lingli honestly and said, all the money is spent on your physique. I don't have money to poison you. You can ask me. Lingli remembered that Suli had a surplus of tens of thousands of taels of silver. He was stunned for a moment. He suppressed the throbbing in his heart and took a deep breath. He said, a long time ago there was a person. In order to protect her, I killed countless people. In order to stabilize the position of the head of the family, I was willing to give up everything. She could also make wine. The osmanthus wine was my favorite. She could also make good dishes. The dishes she made were my favorite. Lingli gradually immersed in the memory, But he didn't find that Su Li's eyes were getting colder and colder. She could also refine poison. Few people in the world could detoxify the poison. In the end, she poisoned me with her own hands. I don't know what I owe her. I don't know what resentment she had in her heart. I don't know whether she came here like me. Until I met you, I gradually began to doubt your identity. You're tuning in to the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.